and they believe they can know more than they're capable of, which is crazy because most of these people are atheists. It's the weirdest thing. The people that seem to feel that there's no limitation in physical matter are most often, atheists. It's strange. You think, if you had let's say, a view of the world based on spirit, you might think, oh, well, I have a soul, therefore my mind is somehow whole. But if it's a materialistic theory, then I'm just some sort of crazy machine, which is a result of a whole series of accidents in history. And to a degree, I work, but there must be a lot of holes in my mind, a lot of lacunae, as the pundits would say. I remember Rudolf Steiner's whole angle, the crazy mystic, when he was into philosophy. He was profoundly dissatisfied with the idea that there were limits to human knowledge. But famously, of course, Darwin's dog. Darwin said, could a dog comprehend the mind of Sir Isaac Newton? And that's probably the best sort of additional sum up to this particular line. Yeah, studying philosophy, you get the feeling you're happy with your car until you start to see all the limitations and defects in it and you want an upgrade. And you look at yourself more and more and you start to feel, I really want an upgrade. So is faith the really great thing? Believing, in despite of the facts, that you're okay. Uh, yes, ignorance is bliss, obviously. The mind, when we've freed the mind of all the factual fears, then we're free to be happy.
Well, maybe you should spend some more time a little bit with Aristotle. If the objective is not to study philosophy, but to live philosophically, it's a it's a type of living, not a you know not academic philosophy. Studies philosophers, compares arguments, writes papers and stuff.
Well, did
Knows.
Aristotle manage to live differently?
I never knew the man, Stephen.
Well, if ignorance is bliss, then a lot of people would be very happy now with the chaos and the financial markets, because how happy would they be? Because they're not aware of that. So I don't know.
As your Lord Emperor said, this will hurt China more than it will hurt America.
That's probably true. And there's more ignorant people in China as well. So they'll also be very blissful.
Well, it'd be interesting to see, but there's a good possibility that it'll bring down the Communist Party in China. What Ronald Reagan did to the Soviet Union, Trump believes he can do to Communist China.
Yes. Strange days indeed.
Of course, much of what resulted from the Reagan presidency were things he would have never have abdicated.
Yeah. But I'm going to take us back 1,500 years. Let's go to chapter 6 of Millennia and Microcosm. This is week 140 of our ongoing Millennia and Microcosm seminar for Kenneth Smith. For those who are just joining us this week, we are working our way through a book. Hello, welcome to the call. We are working our way through a book that has not been published yet, but all the individual chapters have been published as a column in the back of a magazine called The Comics Journal from 1998 to 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. Right around the turn of the millennium, he wrote this. And David and I are walking this group through the texts, and we are typesetting the text and getting it ready to publish as a book in book form. And for those who haven't been on these calls before, the premise of this book is that as moderns, we take it for granted that we see the world in the most scientific, objective way anybody's ever seen the world. But there's no evidence that's true. It's more ideology than fact that that's the case. Hegel, the Greeks, Kenneth Smith, they argue that every epoch has its zeitgeist. There is a spirit of the age. It includes a worldview that causes everybody in that age to interpret in similar ways. Even when they argue with each other, they argue within a frame that they can't see. They think that they're freely arguing, but it's like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, which was a medieval preoccupation, is a question that medieval people always answered in various limited ways that assumed their worldview. And in the same way, moderns assume our worldview. We're the best, we're the brightest, we're the most advanced, we're the most objective, we're the most scientific. Everybody before us was some kind of primitive savage on a great stair step leading to us, and we're just so modern. So the project for this book is Kenneth Smith wants to walk us through 3 epochs of history. He wants to take us through the ancient epoch. He wants to take us through the medieval epoch. And then armed with those 2 worldviews, having kind of learned to see from those 2, interpretive frameworks, then in the final chapters of the book, he'll take us back to the modern epoch so that we can start to see its worldview in a new way. So like our problem is the problem of fish in the water. We don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't fish because they never are without it. So how do they know? Or they take it for granted. We take things for granted and we don't know what they are. But after we finish this exercise of going through the ancient epoch in chapter 4 and going through the medieval epoch in chapters 5 through, I don't remember how far it goes, 12, 13, then we'll be prepared to look at the modern epoch with fresh eyes. So we just finished last week, we finished chapter 5, which introduced the medieval epoch. And it set it up paragraph by paragraph in contrast against the major parts of the ancient worldview that we discussed in chapter 4. So that was where we got our big introduction. And now starting in chapter 6, which we're beginning this week, we're going to go sort of kind of one idea at a time. Kenneth is going to sort of exercise some of the main interesting features of the medieval epoch and the medieval worldview. In chapter 6, there's a link in the chat to the text for those who want it. And I'm also pasting in the text as we go. In chapter 6, he's using poet and philosopher and artist William Blake to kind of comment upon the medieval worldview. And that's because Blake was a Christian mystic. So as a Christian mystic, on the one hand, he's very sympathetic to what the medieval epoch claims to be its worldview. It's very centered in Christianity, very focused on that. But he's not writing in the 500s or the 700s or the 1000s. He's writing in the modern era. He's looking back retrospectively. I think it was Kierkegaard who said that what makes life difficult is that it can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. So with William Blake, you get this interesting perspective where kind of saturated in this, as to the extent that he can make it kind of authentically Christian mystical worldview, he's commenting upon where do the medievals, embody Jesus's message and where do they violate Jesus's message? To what extent are they living up to what they claim to be their ideal? And as he talks about in chapter 6, this is something that other people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Goethe and others have also critiqued. But in this chapter, it's William Blake. Kenneth Smith is a big fan of William Blake. We talk about Kenneth Smith's philosophy and the influences upon him, and we often talk about the ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle, Heraclitus, and a few others. Then we talk about Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Marx to some extent, Hannah Arendt, Philip Reef, and so on. We're sort of talking about this existentialist tradition of philosophy, where they're trying not to create a system of thinking like Kant did, but instead they're trying to help us to look at our existential condition, however it may be, systematized or not systematized. What is our actual condition we find ourselves in? And I've been summarizing that list of people for quite a while, and occasionally I add people like Kafka or Dostoevsky, but I often forget to mention William Blake, and I really shouldn't do that, because Kenneth Smith loves William Blake. William Blake has a very pronounced point of view. He's very insightful. He's great with the witty quip, with the small number of words that says an enormous amount, that you really want to chew on and think about. And all of those are things that Kenneth Smith admires. Likewise, just like William Blake is both an artist and a philosopher, Kenneth Smith is also an artist. He paints and he draws, and he's very receptive to that philosophical worldview that says, to engage with life isn't just to intellectualize and abstract about it. It's also to really live it and experience it and feel it, and get your hands dirty, get the paint on your hands, get into it. So he sees William Blake saying things not just because he's a Christian mystic, but because of his artistry, because of his hands-on, immersive, experiential, gnostic approach to life. So with that said, why don't we dive in? Kenneth Smith starts with a couple of sentences of his own to kick off the William Blake quotes. He says, the Christian mystic William Blake laid down some of the most auspicious premises for making historical and spiritual sense of Jesus. In other words, he's a Jesus interpreter. He's trying to help us understand where Jesus is coming from. And he's not just doing it from one perspective. He both wants us to understand the spirituality of Jesus, but also what was Jesus' historical condition? Because Jesus, when he speaks, is speaking to a specific audience at a specific time who have a specific worldview. And we may enjoy his words, but he wasn't talking to us. He might know us now, but when he spoke then, he was speaking from within a particular context. And Kenneth likes the way that William Blake emphasizes that and brings it to life and helps us to see kind of what's meant for us and what's not meant for us. He continues, he says, Blake offers a refreshing and searching mind, true humility and true acuity in one. Right? So on the one hand, he's deeply insightful, but on the other hand, he's a humble guy. He's constantly saying, I'm only human. I'm not some oracle. I'm not some prophet. You shouldn't be listening to me. I'm just trying to engage you in the larger conversation of life. And Kenneth likes this because that's Kenneth's approach. Kenneth doesn't want people to go around being, his apostles who memorize all the things he says and are defending it the way Zeno defended Parmenides. He's saying, no, Kenneth says, when I'm writing, I'm constantly referring to other people. I talk about William Blake. I talk about Paul Valéry. He says, I talk about, Dostoevsky. As I'm pointing, that's the finger pointing to the moon. Don't look at my finger. Look away from me and look at the moon. There's this whole conversation of life and philosophy and history that's been going on for thousands of years. And he's trying to engage us with that, not attach us to him. And so he loves that William Blake is doing the same thing. William Blake is also pointing outwards. He's the finger pointing to the moon, right? So I'm gonna take us through these quotes because they're related to each other, and then we'll stop and talk about them for a little bit before we go on. So the first William Blake quote, these quotes are all from either Marriage of Heaven and Hell or from the marginalia associated with Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So he starts out, all deities reside in the human breast, says William Blake. Right? That is not a medieval perspective. The medieval perspective is that God existed before the cosmos, before people. He's not in here. He can be in here if he wants to, but he's before the cosmos. He's a transcendent God. This is what the medievals believe. And here's William Blake, and he's doing what Goethe did and Nietzsche did. He's marrying the ancient idea of a God who does not transcend the cosmos, but is immanent within it. That everywhere you turn in nature, you see God, says William Blake. And say the ancient Greeks. This was the ancient Greek belief, right? That there's here too there are gods, says Heraclitus, as someone approaches his campfire in the dark, coming to visit him. There's gods everywhere. Gods in the trees. There's gods in the springs and the rocks. There's gods in the sky. The sacred is everywhere, says this ancient perspective. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the call.
Yeah, bye.
And this perspective that William Blake is giving us is it's got that quality, right? Because as Heraclitus says, there's a nature around us, which we look around and see, but there's also the nature within us. What is our character? What is our soul? Who are we becoming? Who are we, who have we been? How have we grown into the person we are? And what future transformations await us that our character is still trying to urge us on to become, like the oak becoming, the acorn becoming the oak. And William Blake is centering the divine in inside that nature in the human breast, the ethos. The ethos anthropoi daimon, Kenneth doesn't have to quote it here. Just the fact that he's put this sentence here from William Blake should evoke that for the reader after having got through chapter 4. This idea that Heraclitus says, our inner nature, our character, is so powerful an influence on our behavior, whether we're aware of it or not, that it's as though it's a god. Yeah, like I often, for the people who are new to this call, I often talk about my family heritage of alcoholism. I don't drink because all of the adult members of my family, going back multiple generations on both sides, crawled into the bottle and couldn't get out of it for, in some cases, many years, and in other cases for their entire lives. My grandma Pat was in the bottle until the day she died. My wife doesn't have this problem. Most people don't have this problem, but if you're born with it, if it's in your nature, you have to know about it. It's important to know that it's there. And the Greeks believe that's the key to life, is to know what is in here, what is in your character that is working on you and that has an influence on you. And they're saying that authority needs to be recognized and learned about. And this is what William Blake is alluding to in this first quote, when he says all deities reside in the human breast. Now, this is antithetical to the medieval orthodoxy. The medieval orthodoxy is that God has access to what's in your heart, but God's not just in there. God is transcendent. And he created the universe, and he created the people, and he could have made us any way that he wanted to. He just happened to make us this way. And so there's no point in focusing on nature, and there's no point in focusing on, people. You should be focusing exclusively on God, who's the sole source of truth and love and meaning and so forth. So this is one of the ways in which we've in chapter 5, we talked about the idea that the orthodox position in the medieval perspective is not the only medieval perspective. The medieval worldview is not solely defined by the orthodoxy of the powers that, the papacy, by the clergy, by the nobility. They're not the only source of definition of what the medieval perspective was. The medieval world had this tug of war, this dialectic between, on the one hand, this orthodoxy that was trying to stamp out all variation and make everybody believe the same thing. But on the other hand, this mystical Christian movement that was all kinds of people in all kinds of places at all kinds of times trying to go back to the original message of Jesus. Like Francis of Assisi, right? The Franciscan movement arose specifically as a reaction against the way that clergy and monastic groups that existed at Francis's time had slipped to the point where they were accumulating wealth. And Francis said, there are poor people all around us. Why are you not sharing this wealth to make their lives better? These people are miserable, and their lives could be so improved with even just a fraction of that money that you're putting into gold thread, and beautiful gold miters and orbs. And it's like, forget about that stuff. You didn't see Jesus going around carrying gold orbs and gold miters and collecting piles of gold and saying, woo, this is what it's about. No, you saw Jesus in poverty and reaching out to the poor and helping them. And so Francis starts this counter movement against the orthodoxy, and that eventually gets recognized by the church as a movement that they can't stamp out. It's a heresy they can't get rid of. And so they allow it to become a monastic order, a spiritual movement, a mystical movement, the Franciscans. And all of these, there's going to be dozens and dozens of these mystical traditions arising over and over across the 1,000 years of the medieval epoch. And they're reacting because over and over of the dialectic between the orthodox position, the canon that they want you to memorize, and this is what you're supposed to do, and this is how you're supposed to behave, and if you don't, we're going to punish you on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Jesus, who seems to be giving a very different message. So there's this orthodox position that helps to define the medieval epoch, but there's also this mystical impulse that also defines the medieval worldview. And the mystical impulse is every bit as important to understanding the medieval epoch as the central over-controlling orthodoxy. So when we see in this first quote, when we see William Blake saying something that would have, given fits to the centralized clergy for centuries in the medieval epoch, this idea of centering, first of all, centering God in the human breast, but second of all, deities plural. I mean, how hard did the medieval orthodoxy fight to say there's only one, everything else is a demon. There's no other sources of meaning but the one and only one God. And here's William Blake casually referring to all deities. There's like this kind of polytheistic impulse in his mysticism, and it comes from the pantheism. It's very hard to be strictly monotheistic and also pantheistic. If you look at nature and see something sacred, you can't help but notice that in nature, things are often in conflict with each other. The water rushes down and works against the bank, and the bank resists the water, and there's a tug of war going on in nature. And everywhere we look at nature, there are these interesting dialectics. That's why the Greeks were polytheistic. And yeah, Goethe, says Stephen in the chat. Goethe had the same impulse, right? Goethe looked around at nature and had the same reaction. There's the sacred is everywhere. It's not like the sacred is only outside the world and we have this tiny thin line of grace, and I hope he doesn't drop us and we all end up in hell. It's no, there's God's the sacredness, the divine is everywhere we look. There's just miracles happening. So here we see, in chapter 5, we didn't focus at all on the mystical movements of the medieval epoch. We really focused on the core Orthodox position and how it was a pushback against the ancient worldview, and how it pushed back every major tenet of the ancient worldview without exception. I mean, it overthrew its politics, it overthrew its economics, it overthrew its religion, it overthrew its conception of the human soul and what is virtue and what is vice. All of those things got topsy-turvy overturned by the Central Orthodox position. But right off the bat, we're just in the second sentence of paragraph 6, and here's Kenneth bringing in this mystical position that is weirdly harmonized with the pre-medieval ancient perspective. It's a reconciliation, if you will, of what seemingly two incompatible opposites, the Orthodox position and the ancient position. So that's the first thing I wanted to draw to our attention. Should we go on to the second quote for Blake? Let's go on to the second quote. God only acts and is in existing beings or men. Now, this is another wild, radical claim, right? The central position is that God is omnipotent and omnipresent. He's everywhere, including places that people aren't. And he's omnipotent, which means he doesn't need people to act. He can make a planet appear or disappear. He can do whatever he wants. He's all powerful. And this dates back to this position of the orthodoxy, dates back to the old debates between the early Christian fathers and the ancient ancient clergy and philosophers, when they were trying to one up the ancient clergy and philosophers. Oh, your God is God of the ocean? How petty. My God is the God of all things, including the ocean. So my God's bigger than your God, so you have to give it up. Oh, your God can do some things, but not others. You can't violate the laws of nature. Well, my God created nature. The laws of nature are whatever he wants them to be. He can change them at any time. Or he could let the laws be there and then do something that absolutely contradicts them. Our God can do anything. This omnipotence was part of the arms race in these debates. How do you win the debate? So to have a position here claiming that God only is in existing beings or men puts incredible limitations upon the divine that the early church fathers would never have agreed to. So here again, we're seeing ways in which the mystical Christian position, of which Blake is an example, is not just slightly different from the Orthodox medieval perspective, but it's in direct opposition to it, and in opposition on its fundamental, most important ideas: omnipotence and omnipresence. There's this science fiction and fantasy author I really enjoy. I just finished going back through her fantasy series, Lois McMaster Bujold. She's tied with Heinlein for having won the most Hugo and Nebula awards ever. And she's got a fantasy series set in the world of the five gods, and it's focused on religion. And it's a polytheistic, I guess you'd have to say pentatheistic religion, in which there's five deities. But one of the core premises of that religion is that the gods have no hands but ours. The gods don't run around making mountains appear and disappear and making planets appear and disappear. The gods inspire us to do the right thing. And if we want the will of the gods to be carried out in the world, then we have to become empty vessels for their inspiration and then go forth and do the right thing, so the things they want to happen can happen. That's we're here to help them to act. This is a premise, and I was struck when I read this Blake quote. I've never read Marriage of Heaven and Hell. I've read some other Blake, but I haven't read this. Welcome back, Gilnos. And so I was really struck by this when he said, you can parse this sentence apart in a variety of ways, but part of it is God only acts in existing men. Through our actions in life, God is able to enact change to make the world a better place. This is also a tenet of liberation theology, which is a modern Latin American interpretation, a mystical movement, political mystical movement inspired by these things. So here's William Blake kind of echoing, St. Oscar Ramirez and other liberation theologists, and sort of foreshadowing this fictional depiction of religion that I've been enjoying reading this last several weeks. And it really bowled me over how different a position this is from the official canonical medieval position of the dominant powers that be for that 1,000 years that the medieval epoch reigned. So why don't I pause here, because we've got hands. So Donald, tell us what's on your mind. Oh, but you got to come off mute. You were off mute and you pressed mute.
Sorry. It seems in some ways this also is forward-looking, Blake, physics doesn't allow a place in the universe for God. He may be as Spinoza, outside of time and outside of space, but this sort of sidesteps objections from atheism. Well, where's God? Well, he's in us, or he's in other beings or organisms. The immanence arguments allow one to sort of sidestep modern criticisms also. They don't just look back to the Greeks, I think, and you can correct me on this because I've never read Blake. I was kind of surprised to see these comments, but these comments show up in other arguments by people far more modern who want to have Christianity and physics at the same time. Well, that's enough.
Well, that was good. So I think you're right on. It's part of what happens with modern Christians, and not just modern Christians, but religious people in the modern world, is that they have to work their way through this crisis that was created by science, because when we're dealing with a dark age, like if we're talking the 600s, 700s, when literacy is collapsing in Europe, And education is collapsing in Europe. And there's a great deal people are forgetting about how does the world work. It's easy to put God and define God however you want to. And one of the most common things that's done, which is not apparent at the time, is what's called the God of the gaps. Anything you don't understand, you just say that was God. It's like, okay, that ladder, that was not God because I built that ladder. But I have no idea where that mountain came from, so that was God. And the problem with God of the gaps is that it seems like a powerful God when you're in a dark age. But as you build up your science and technology and you learn to explain more and more, less of the world is dark to you and requires an explanation. And therefore, fewer and fewer things get explained as, well, God did that. And so God seems to shrink. And this creates a crisis in a religion. Nobody, especially a religion that's founded on the concept of an omnipotent God, the last thing in the world that it wants is to see their God shrinking and becoming smaller. And so there is this thing that happens when an epoch gets more scientifically and technologically sophisticated, but it still understands the importance of the sacred. It's trying to figure out, how do I define the sacred in a sustainable and an inspiring way? Exactly what you're saying, Donald. They say, God isn't here to give us he's not the answers at the back of the book. That's not God's purpose. God's purpose isn't, now I have a way to explain things. God's purpose is to inspire us to do the right thing. And therefore, anytime anybody acts anywhere, there is enormous scope for the sacred to be directly involved. And furthermore, it becomes a less of an explanatory, pragmatic, God will make the crops grow, and becomes more of a ethical, moral, how do we do the right thing? How are we to know what we should be doing? It's, in other words, it's a more impressive sacred because it's directly tied to these more pressing questions, which is, how am I to know what I should do in this situation? It's like, well, yeah, this is where you want the sacred. You want inspiration to help you do the right thing. So yeah, I think you're right, Donald. It's less that William Blake is reconciling medieval religion with modern science, but it's what you said, which is, this is a problem that also came up for the Greeks. He's not so much quoting the Greeks as he is in the same position that the Athenians were in as they transitioned from mythos culture to logos culture. As their technological and scientific prowess increased, they had the same problem that we had in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And they resolved it the same way that we did, which is God of the inner nature, the character, the ethos, what is to be done. That's the God that we need. Especially as our ability to do things increases, and therefore our capacity to make terrible mistakes increases. It becomes ever more important. What is to be done as a surer and surer, a source of wisdom to guide us. So thanks for that, Donald. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, well, first of all, I like Blake a lot because he was, you might say that he was the one that started the era of Romanticism in a way. And in some sense, both looking at nature, but also looking at the divine. But I found perhaps a contradiction, a problem with the first two quotes. The first one, all deities reside in the human breast. But I looked specifically at the second one, God only acts in existing beings of men. But that God is capitalized, the deities in lowercase. So is he sort of struggling between the plurality of pantheism and the singularity of the singular God? Or does the singular God have many, many arms and legs? Like like uh, well, Shiva. It's like so so is he sort of mixing up the plurality or the singularity? And the third question I have is, particularly with this, was he a pantheist or was he a what's called panentheist? Because he seemed to put a lot of weight on men as the supreme species in relationship with all the other species and nature in a sense. So that seems like there's thought and knowing, and so is I always thought that there was God and there was the world. I mean, in traditional way of thinking, and the world represented his handiwork, as Galileo said. There's a contradiction between his handiwork and the whatever, and the mind of God. So, is there a problem with the fact that, in a sense, man in particular has achieved, I guess, a greater assimilation of God's spirit that he now takes over for creating something? And in some sense, is that not a kind of a funny form of Copernican turn? In other words, man is still at the center of the universe in a funny way, right? Copernican turn only means that analytically and intellectually, but here the Copernican turn turns in the heart of man. So I want those questions are kind of important because it really lays out what the Romantic period was, how it differs from the Copernican term of Copernicus, and how it differs in Romanticism. That's it. That's my question. Complex question, I think, but
A great question. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, this is Christian pantheists tend to have an interesting, I'm going to use a Phil word, equivocation between monotheism and pantheism. And it's almost as though rather than being forced onto one side or the other of the question, they answer it with a dialectic. Say yes, one and many at the same time. And that's really compatible in some ways with the medieval perspective, because remember, the medieval perspective starts with one God, but then also three in one. It's the one who are three and the three who are one. But then it also surrounds them. Also, there's Mary, which at sometimes she's seen as the Holy Spirit, and sometimes she's seen as separate from the Holy Spirit. But then beyond that, there's the saints, and the saints play a critically important role in the medieval church. They're often the access to God. People often pray to the saint and not to God because they're asking the saint to intermediate for them with God. Maybe God's more likely to listen to the saint than to listen to me. So I try to get the saint to, if the saint approves, maybe the saint will talk to God and God will be more likely to respond. So there is already this equivocation between monotheism and polytheism that becomes the norm in the medieval period. And it would have horrified the early church fathers who didn't have any saints yet. For them, absolutely monotheism in complete stark contrast to any they weren't willing to compromise at all on that point. That was their center point. But it's just a few hundred years later and we're already starting to accumulate saints. And by 500 years later, the saints already have this sacred role that they play between man and God. So it's not such a big step for William Blake, who sees the sacred in nature, to set up in his own mind a dialectic between monotheism and polytheism and resolve the problem that way. So that's why he can change from one phrase, it's God, and the next phrase, it's deities.
well, let me ask you another question that came up with your equivocation. It almost seems, and since you love music particularly, and symphonies in particular, is symphony the correct, in a sense, manifestation of this transition? Because you have a conductor and you have a symphony. There's the many and the singularity. And the conductor plays a very important role rather than just chamber music, which is also, in my mind, also very high. But nonetheless, there are individuals that coordinate in sort of abstract relationship to each other, whereas the symphony, the conductor definitely is the God person in a funny way, metaphorically. I don't mean whatever, because they have to kind of follow his lead. Now, sometimes they don't, and
Right.
the conductor gets very angry, I mean.
Yes.
So is that the metaphor? God is still in control, but
Yes.
he's conducting a symphony, and the symphony have their own will as well, but they follow
Yes.
the capital G God.
You can see that in Tolkien,
Yeah.
J.R.R. Tolkien. His Silmarillion lays out the, sort of his cosmology and theology for Middle Earth. And in it, he has these various powers, the Valar and the Maiar. And the Valar and the Maiar are created by Eru, who is Iluvatar, the one god. And he creates the cosmos with a great choir. The Valar sing with Eru Iluvatar, and in their singing, they create the cosmos. And Melkor, who becomes known as Morgoth later, is a villain because he wants people to think about him, not about the harmony. And so he sings out of key and creates a dissonance. And that dissonance becomes the evil in the world of Middle Earth, from which we get orcs and dragons and giant spiders and all those other things. So that notion of the one God as a great conductor of that God's many powers, who might be personified as saints or as Blake's deities, it's got a long tradition. And when Tolkien does that, Tolkien was a pretty devout Christian, and he was Anglican. So he's not trying to set up in Middle Earth. He's not trying to set up an opposition to his own innate Christianity. He's trying to communicate his Christianity in a way that he thinks the reader might find understandable. And this is how he resolves that dialectic, just the way you're talking about. Catholic. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Right, you're right. Catholic, not Anglican. So yeah, I mean, these are the sorts of things that people have to wrestle with these issues. Somebody like Blake or Tolkien, he's not at the borderline between epochs where he's able to revolutionize and create a new religion, right? The church fathers were creating a new religion. They were taking Christianity, they were taking the teachings of Jesus and Paul and shaping them into something new that they could use to overcome the resistance of the ancient world to these ideas, and thus they created medieval Christianity. But Blake and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and others, they're working within a tradition. They're not able to revolutionize as deeply. And so what you're, even when they're bold like Blake is, they're expressing, in their clearest way they can, mystical spiritual threads that were already present in the culture. They're just bringing them to the fore and illuminating them in a way that we can comprehend. It's interesting stuff. And this thing about, you also talked about humanity being at the center, and of course, there's a number of ways to explain that. The medieval explanation would be that animals can't sin, only people can sin, which I think was a typical medieval perspective. The cheetah does no wrong, but we can do right or wrong. The cheetah can't be good or evil. The cheetah is as it was made to be, but human beings can be good or evil. We have this problem that the other animals don't have. And so all these questions of salvation or damnation that the medieval worldview, the Orthodox medieval worldview is obsessed with, these are human problems, and they put humanity at the center of the great drama of history. Not because we're the best, but because we're the most challenged. This is the drama that we need to learn about. And cheetah's good. Cheetah's covered. Cheetah doesn't have a problem. So I think that's the way to, that would be the medieval take. And I think that take is probably shared by both the central power structures, orthodoxy, and by the mystical traditions. I don't know of any medieval mystical traditions that said that animals could sin. I think pretty much the medievals all pretty much agreed God's got them covered there. And in doing that, I would note, this is where we've talked about how when there's a revolution from one epoch to the next, the revolutionaries directly challenge the things that are incompatible, and they make their argument on those points. And then they think they've made a whole new way of life and a whole new way of seeing a new epoch. but they only thought to challenge certain things. They didn't think to challenge other things. And this idea that the animals don't have the problem that people do, this should sound familiar to anybody who was with us when we went through chapter 4, because that's the ancient Greek perspective too. The animals have sophrosune, plants have sophrosune, fungi have sophrosune. If they knew about bacteria and viruses, they would say they have sophrosune. We're the only one that doesn't. We're the only one that lacks the compass in the brain to point us in a healthy direction. We might point in a healthy direction, but we might, point in a completely unhealthy direction. We pick up a cup and drink from it, and we don't know whether it's got poison or, something nutritious in it. We can get just as excited about, our poisons as we can about vitamins. We just can't tell them apart. Emotionally, we can't tell them apart. And and as someone who's got the genes for alcoholism, I'm a classic example. The alcoholic mistakes the bottle for a source of vitality and health. It says, "This is my salvation. I am feeling terrible, but I know how to fix it. I'm going to crawl into this bottle." That's an example of something that the animals don't do. It's not that they don't get drunk. They only get drunk once in a while, when it's in season and the fruits have fallen off the tree and they're fermenting. All the giraffes and everything, they all show up and they get down there and they all stagger around going, "Woo!" And then after it's over, they go back on with their lives. They don't say, "Now I'm going to live that way every day." Only a person would do that, right? So we're the ones with the drama. But the ancients and the medievals agree about that, but have a different explanation. The medieval explanation has to do with salvation and damnation, and the ancient perspective has to do with sophrosune, or the lack of sophrosune. It's interesting, right? This is one of the first things we've come across that doesn't change across that revolutionary boundary between the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. It changes quality, it changes explanation, but the division between us and everything else remains. Glunos, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. And welcome to the call.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. It's my first time. I just wanted to say I love Blake. I heard him saying, "I saw God looking at me through my window." I believed him right away. I didn't question. He saw God. God saw him. I believe him. I don't question at all. I am Muslim, but I'm married to a Christian. I'm not interested in converting him or being converted, because at the end of the day, I think all religions say the same thing. There's not much of a difference between them. In fact, I am Muslim and I don't question his belief, and we are not very religious people. In fact, my Islam is full of Christianity, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, so I cannot question anyone. The thing I want to talk about deities in Islam, there's a very interesting, it's full of practice, by the way. Islam is all about practical religion. It doesn't have a lot of do this like 10 commandments we don't have. There are 5 obligations like visit Makkah, pray 5 times, do fasting once a year, 30% of your income goes to the poor. That's it. I forgot the 5th. What was the 5th? 5-time prayers. Did I mention that? 5-time prayers, yeah. So when they pray 5 times, they do this. At the end of every prayer, they greet their right shoulder, they greet their left shoulder. And on the right shoulder, we have a saint. On the left shoulder, we have a Satan. In Islam, there is no exorcism. We don't exorcise. Demon, we accept the existence of good and bad power, if you look at it that way, as part of the nature. We don't remove them from us. That purity, I don't know, is it? I question purity sometimes, because the purity of Jesus ended up in a place where he's bleeding and suffering. Sometimes quite question. It's a fault of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky showed me, look, Jesus is suffering, he's bleeding, people, look, take a notice of it. Till then, I didn't see it. I swear, like how I didn't see it. Dostoevsky showed me. So the deities, I think he's not talking about monotheism, polytheism. He's talking about the forces in religion. But I want to ask a question about morality and immorality here. There's a very good sentence. I think it's Kenneth Smith sentence. Jesus is a moral genius. I love that sentence, but I always thought that morality and immorality, they are the terminologies the philosophers, the scientists made up as a response to Christian or religious institutions. Because in religion, I don't think morality, immorality exist. Everything is a force. We accept it. We learn to live with it in harmony. That's how I look at it. So how deity is clear. It's no monotheism, polytheism for me. We've got one God. Everyone calls differently, but we've got different forces. That way. But that morality. How can we interpret it?
Yes. Thank you, Gulnaz. Very helpful. Yeah, those the 5 pillars of Islam. I put a link there for folks who aren't familiar with them. What she's talking about with Islam being more of a practice than an intellectual debate. This is one of the ways in which Islam retains a critical part of the ancient worldview. Because to the ancients, as we saw in chapter 5, religion is a practice. It's something you do together. It's a way of acting in the world more than it is a question of personal salvation or damnation. It's like that became a medieval Christian obsession, but not all medieval religions went that way. Islam, which developed during the medieval period, it retained that ancient focus on practice, on actions. As we'll see in medieval Christianity, there ends up being a big tug of war about faith versus good works. But in Islam, that tug of war is not really there. Good works is pretty much at the center of the religion. You have to do the good things. You have to take care of each other. You have to, especially I'm particularly struck by the charity, the giving to the hungry and the poor. It's one of the central tenets of Islam. And in that it's carrying through that ethical obligation to act in the world and to not just chase your tail into questions of, am I saved or am I not saved, which happens sometimes in modern forms of Christianity, the kind of obsessive, self-focused version of the religion. So I really appreciate that being brought up. It's one of the things that we want to do over the next year and a half while we work our way through the medieval section is that we want to complement Kenneth's text. I said this when we first started chapter 5. We want to complement Kenneth's text with our own readings and interpretations and additions drawn from Judaism, Islam, medieval Chinese religion, medieval Japanese religion. Medievalism is a much broader thing than Christianity. There's a lot more involved. It's this, and they share in common this idea that political authority, in the medieval structure of that during that period, that political authority should derive from divine authority. That you should no longer have kings who don't care about what God tells us to do. That you should have rulers who are at least as holy as the rest of the people, who are at least as pious, who are at least as concerned about those things. Now you see that, whether you see that in the form of the divine right of kings in Europe, whether you see that in the form of the mandate of heaven in China, you see it in all of these medieval religions. They share that in common. And it's one of the big differences between the medieval epoch and the modern epoch, is the modern epoch, by overthrowing God and having parliaments and markets decide everything, ultimately it removes one of the most important checks on human hubris, which the medievals were better at than we are. And the medievals were better at saying there needs to be something above human beings. There needs to be something leashing us to good behavior. And the modern world says, no, whoever's got the most money can do whatever they want. Whoever's got the most votes can do whatever they want. And we have this unleashed nihilistic thing going on. So I really appreciate, I hope you come to future ones of these if you can, and keep bringing this the Islamic perspective. It's really essential to what we're going to be doing over the next year and a half. We have Ari, not today, but many days. We have Ari here, and he often brings the Jewish perspective and is able to tell us what do Jewish mystics have to say, what does Kabbalah have to say, and so on. And I'm looking for sources for medieval Christianity and medieval China and medieval Japan. And if I can't find them, I may just have to do the reading myself and bring it in. But we want to get that full rounded picture, because it really helps to separate what's just a detail of Christianity versus what's really central to medievalism. You know, having the Islamic perspective helps an enormous amount with that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just a bit stuck with that one. God only acts and is in existing beings or men. I was just looking at the wider context of the paragraphs that were surrounding it, like, thus one portion of being is the prolific, the other the devouring. To the devourer it seems as if the producer was in his chains, but it is not so. He only takes portions of existence and fancies that whole, but the prolific would cease to be prolific unless the devourer, as a sea, received the excess of his delights. Some will say, is not God alone the prolific? I answer, God only acts and is in existing beings or men. These two classes of men are always upon the earth, and they should be enemies. Whoever tries to reconcile them seeks to destroy existence. Religion is an endeavour to reconcile the two. So I'll have to spend quite a lot of time with that one for sure, I think. It brings up the contrast between the prolific and the devourers. So essentially saying there's people that create and people that consume. I wonder about the word prolific. I bring up the case of the oak tree that will produce a huge amounts of acorns which never succeed in becoming an oak tree. Well, a Monty Python, of course, will lament all the poor sperms that get nowhere. So I was wondering what you think about that, Rick.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for taking us to the actual text of the William Blake original. It's one of the exercises that I like to do with Kenneth's quotes. It's really helpful when if he gives you a quote, go find the original source and then look at the larger context around it. Sometimes Kenneth is selecting the quote because it carries with it the larger context. Sometimes he's not, and you just have to look at case by case to see when is he doing it one way and when is he doing the other. Frequently, he'll take a sentence just because he thinks by itself it encapsulates some critical idea. I'm going to have to spend more time with this William Blake text, just like you, before I can say which is happening here. And it's harder with William Blake. Trying to do this with William Blake is like trying to do it with Kafka or with Kenneth. It's not as easy always to be sure where they're going with the text until you really spend a lot of quality time with it. The poetic side and the metaphorical side of what they're doing can make it a challenge.
I suppose there's an element, the sort of traditional medieval view was there's a perfect order above in heaven, and what is good is already perfectly worked out. And there's an evil order below man, and man's in the middle, but all man has to do is to keep to the good and avoid the evil, and he goes to heaven.
Yes.
But it's saying, Blake seems to be saying it's not quite that simple.
Yes.
That the manifestation of the heavenly, the goods, and the hell and the evil it only manifests in men and perhaps to some degree in other creatures. We don't really, well, there might be, but we don't really have a demonic world which is directly in front of us. It only manifests through, let's say, people. And good only manifests through people. Of course, I was suggesting he was pointing to a dynamic between these two principles. And one is the creative and the other is the destructive, in a sense. The one creates, the other consumes. And so, yeah, that's a sort of a bit of a mystery there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, from this passage that this quote is drawn from, one gets the impression that Blake is talking about along the lines of the Hindu deity Shiva, the dance of creation and destruction at the same time, that they're related to each other. And when he's saying, if there was only creation and no destruction, where would the excess creation go? And there needs to be both sides. But if there was too much destruction, so he's talking about the dialectic between the two, and it makes sense both from his love of nature, where you're going to see this going on. It's somebody needs to keep the bunnies in check, or you end up with Australia being overrun with rabbits, right? But on the other hand, in the modern world, we know that William Blake writes elsewhere about the dark satanic mills of industrialism and how it's mowing down the forests and consuming all the fields, and all of the good is being rendered into destruction. So he's got a number of reasons why he'd be interested in this dialectic between creation and destruction.
Well, the fuel, of course, was wood at the time. Coal was still in its infancy.
Yes.
So quite literally, the forests were being chewed up at a massive rate.
Yeah,
at
that's
the
right.
time.
That's right.
Well, charcoal was the coal of the time, really.
Yes. Before the coal mining.
Before that, there's a special word for coking coal.
Yes.
Was developed. Yeah, it had been developed, but it was how much of it there was. And prior to the broader use of coal, it was the forests were being stripped.
Yeah, to create charcoal, the charcoal burners with the great mounds of wood that they were rendering down into charcoal. Yeah. Without which they couldn't have done industrial steel. Yeah, my old D&D campaign was set in the year 1000, and charcoal burning was a big deal. There was always a mound somewhere where somebody was rendering down wood into charcoal to create that stuff.
From what I'm able to figure out, that it seemed going by weight, and the rule still applies today, that charcoal was worth its weight in grain. So, of course, charcoal was tremendously valuable. I mean, if you wanted to be bourgeoisie back in those days and you wanted to be warm, you'd have a charcoal burner next to you, like a small radiant heater. But that was a very costly activity.
Yes. Yes. And any charcoal that you're using to warm your room is coming at the expense of not being used in a forge somewhere to make you more steel. That's a sword you don't have, or a sheet of armor you don't get because you wanted to warm your room. It's a luxury for sure in around the year 1000. So Gulnose, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Earlier I brought up the morality, and Stephen just spoke about good and bad. There is a line in Surah, we say it in Quran. It says, your chances of doing good is very small, so rush doing it, and your chances of my follow up on it. That's just the one line. I am adding to it. I think our chances of doing bad is also very small. So because we live in a very karmic world, our bare existence is karma. Like whatever we do, we say creates a karma, or we don't even create a karma. So that small chance is if we say good and bad, and we don't even know what is good and bad, and if we cannot define it, how we put a name on, so how are we going to define it? The best way for me, the way I see it, karmic world, the best way is sit in a cave, sit under a banyan tree and do nothing, like no participating. I'm not doing anything. Let's see how it's going to end up, where it's going to end up with, but it doesn't work for me. Yeah, how are you going to, because I believe that there's a universal consciousness out there which needs our human experience. Let's feed into it. Let's see where we're gonna be. I'm not interested in heaven and hell either at the end. By the way, I am that kind of Muslim woman. I believe in reincarnation, and my haven and hell is right here, depending on how I respond to things, how I capable creating, changing my own little hellish life into a better is my little haven. That's how I look at it. Let's be more proactive instead of waiting for someone giving us the apple. Let's go out and catch the apple, but that's gonna be sinful again. So again, we're turning in that. Again, coming back, I don't think there is good and bad. I don't think morality, immorality exist based on what I so far observed and what I read from Quran. I don't know what Bible says and what you guys say. I'm very curious.
Thank you, Gulnaz. And of course, what I'm going to represent on these calls is never a set position, right? Because I'm trying to help Kenneth get us to say, can we see how the ancients would have answered it? And then can we say how the medievals would have answered it differently? And then eventually, by the time we're done with the book, can we see how the moderns answer it differently still? So we've got these three different sets of answers. And it's because our perspective controls the way we interpret the world. And so we want to get to the point where perspectives can be like tools. You can pick them up, use them when they're useful, and put them back down and use a different one when it's more useful. That's kind of what the book is about. It's trying to get to where we kind of get this flexibility. And it sounds like you're already doing that when you talk about, you know, the relationship to all the different religions and different sources of wisdom and how you pull them together wherever they're useful. So yeah. So this we're, you know, right now where we are in chapter 6 is Blake is, you know, introducing us to some particular perspectives on the medieval religions. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But first, we've got Phil's hand is also up. So Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at good and bad in relationship to ever-changing times. I'm thinking, for instance, the world now has 8 billion people. 1,000 years, I mean, back in 1,000, it has much less, and back in, let's say, 500 BC, much less. So you could burn up the forest as much as you want with very few people, and it's not going to hurt the environment. But now, if you do it, it actually changes because the input is changed, okay, in that sense. Also, technology. In the old days, I guess you could kill people with swords and knives and whatever. But now we have an atomic bomb. It changes the dynamic of the situation. You just can't say, well, I'm not going to do any bad things, you know, and my neighbor's not going to do any bad things. And even if they did, it doesn't really matter. But what if they had an atomic bomb? It would matter. And so the condition of the input changes the output, not just what does it really matter. Because, you know, when you got very few people and very little technology, you can't do much harm. It's kind of like an animal in some sense. They can't do any harm because you can only kill so many, you know, antelopes at one time. But let's say if you have some very let's say you had dinosaurs still. I mean, it could ravage everything. So yeah, so you have to think in terms of changing time, changing condition, because the input and the output, both in the technological sense and in the population sense, exhausts the input. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. You know, and that's sort of what you and Gulnaz have both talked about it. It underscores Nietzsche's line where he says, "Power makes stupid." Because the more power you have at your disposal, the easier it is to do big harm. And so it reminds me of I knew a system manager in the VA. He worked at the San Francisco VA named Phil Beza. And he had programmer access. And if you have programmer access to the medical software that people are trying to use to treat patients, you can do an enormous amount of harm with just a few characters. You could accidentally erase the patient file. And so even though he had that access, he hardly ever used it. He did that thing you do where you say, break glass in case of emergency. It's like most of the time he worked with reduced power. And by working with reduced power, it reduced the amount of evil he could do. And then only when it was an emergency and he needed that power would he break the glass and go in and give himself programmer access where it was more dangerous. And so that's kind of like how it is in our everyday lives. I don't want a nuclear bomb in my house. And if I trip and fall, I want to make sure there's no big red button for me to accidentally put my palm on. So if I reduce my power to the level that I need in order to live an ordinary life, then I think like Wilnoz is saying, then it reduces the amount of harm I can do, the good and the bad are dropped to a manageable level. I'm keeping the power locked away somewhere, and only if I need to break the glass do I access it. But when I access it, it's like how it is with the Navajo religion. They say, well, there are things that you can do for protection that you should not do in your everyday life. And you should, if you have to break the glass, you should do it mindfully and saying, okay, now I'm entering dangerous territory. I'm going to do this dangerous thing. I'm more likely to make a bad mistake. And when the danger is over and I don't need it anymore, I'm going to put it away again, take it out of my ordinary life so that I go back to not being able to do great evil. And as part of putting it away, I'm going to honestly confront whatever evil I might have done when I was at that heightened level of power. And I'm going to, try to do justice and restore what I've broken. So that they too have this idea of, the ordinary course of life in which it's hard to do wrong because the ordinary things you do are healthy and good. And then for special cases, you bring out extra power, but you do it mindfully and cautiously. These are related, right? And so you see how sophisticated these ideas are compared to the sort of mindless modern perspective that we should be infinitely free to do whatever we want at any time. We should have all the power. More power is good. This kind of adolescent power fantasies, they really set us up to do bad in the world. Where we have more power than we need just at our fingertips, which means when we screw up, we're more likely to screw up on a big scale instead of a small scale. It's interesting stuff. Phineas, welcome to the call.
Thank you. I also liked the perspective of we only have a small chance of doing a lot of good and we only have a small chance of doing a lot of bad. We all kind of get stuck. We're kind of centered no matter what. And what I like about that is I feel like a lot of people are hard on themselves. They'll like judge themselves for like the things they did wrong. But from like a scaled back perspective, they're not that far away from the average, even if they were really messing up. So I think maybe it could give people some peace, just realizing that they've only really made small mistakes, no matter how much they messed up in a sense. I do think there is a path towards good and then a path backwards too. And I agree with the Lord of the Rings analogy that it's harmony versus dissonance. And so I think maybe harmonizing with people would be more towards the good and then disorder more towards the bad. Also, the last thought is I like the idea that, yeah, with more power, you've got a bigger chance of causing or doing good, but you've got to be more thoughtful the more power you have. And I'm just realizing that here today, because we have access to fossil fuels, i.e. a lot of energy, we all are wielding a lot more money. So that comes into play with our decisions.
Yes, thank you for that, Phineas. Yes. It's there's an ancient Greek idea we've alluded to a couple times on this call, sophrosune. And sophrosune is knowing what you ought to be doing and also knowing what you ought not to be doing. and noticing those things and caring about those things. And Aristotle says, this is the advantage that an acorn has over a human being, that the acorn knows to grow into an oak. It wants to grow into an oak. It's as it becomes a sprout, it's gonna grow its leaves on the side that has the sun, because that's the right side to collect. It needs to collect the sunlight, and it's going to be drawn to the sunlight. And every step of the way, day by day, as it grows and changes, it just naturally wants to do the thing that happens to be healthy for it. And those things that it wants to do, they're not just a simple recipe, stamped out the same everywhere. It's done in a way that pays attention to where the shadows are in its location, as opposed to some other location. And it's why no two oak trees grow the same way. They're all recognizably oak trees, but they're all different too, because they're harmonizing with the specific circumstances they find themselves in. And that caring about the harmony, being interested in the harmony and seeking the harmony, Aristotle says it comes naturally to everybody but human beings. We're the ones who have to work at it. We have to learn how to do it and think about it and try to understand who are we and what do we need to become, and what is this larger world? What are other people doing, and what is nature doing, and how do we weave ourselves into that larger whole and in the healthiest way possible, so that both we and the larger whole can both be healthy at the same time. So what you're saying really resonates. This is one of the core themes of the ancient world, and you see it's being alluded to here by William Blake. We're gonna see more of it as we go along. But William Blake is in giving a voice to that mystical medieval tradition, and you see this outside of Christianity. You see it in the Sufis. You see it all over the place, and in various religions around the world. That longing to pay attention to what's really important and what really matters, and to do right by those things. Socrates calls it doing justice to the rights of the question. When you have a debate, you don't just try to win, you try to really do justice. You say the question itself has rights, it matters, it's part of the world, and you owe it to the world to do right by that question, and not just go for a cheap victory or or what have you. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I find this discussion very, very, very interesting. I'm Christian, at least I practice Christianity, and I think Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all religions, practices of the children of Abraham. Now, talking about morality and immorality, I think the Beatitudes in the New Testament represent a core moral framework in Christianity, which I think is a reflection of the mercy, justice, and compassion that the prophets in the Old Testament talk about. So there is morality and there is morality. There is good and there is wrong. And I believe that as a human being, as you do it's a process here, you're put to here. And if you're given everything is intact, you got a brain, 2 hands, 2 feet, you have the capacity to enlarge your presence here. And you have the tremendous capacity to do wrong, to do good, and to do good. And it's your choice. And your choice depends on the engagement with whichever being you're going to worship or honor. That's it.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, those 5 pillars of Islam, you see a lot of overlap between the Beatitudes and the pillars. They share in common that idea of, you have to take care of the weak. You have to help the people who are suffering. They're the ones who need the help the most. The people who are thriving don't need the help as much. It's like if in your neighborhood one house is on fire, you don't evenly distribute the fire water, the water to put out the fire to all the houses. You focus on who has the need. And you see that in the 5 pillars, and you also see that in the Beatitudes. It's a common theme. And Ari's on the line. I don't want to exclude Judaism here, because where do these things come from? Judaism was already talking about this. To take care of the people who are the most in need.
I'm here. I'm happy to comment when needed, but I'm mostly just listening. But yeah, I so far I pretty much agree with everybody's saying from their different language, different perspective, but overall, yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So, yeah, so it's interesting to see this stuff in Blake. Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm wondering if something I'm noticing and wondering about is whether the issue we're having setting the right course for being a human compared to the oak tree and the acorn is that part of it is that we're trying to stabilize a lot more than just ourselves. We're trying to like create a harmonious world around us between nature and people. And so there's a lot more to reconcile internally because we're taking a lot more into our sort of power. So I'm wondering if that's a factor in why it's harder for us to find the right stable path forward.
Yes, for sure. It's as moderns, we find ourselves not at the beginning of the story. And this is an ancient idea, but in media res, in the middle of the story. And so not only is there the question of what should we do next, but there's also the question of how did we even get here? So of the things that are a problem in the world, how many of them are things that are problems because we made them that way without noticing? And only now are we looking around going, hey, what happened? Where did that come from? So I live in Seattle, and Seattle is part of a relatively rare ecosystem. It's between two mountain ranges. We've got a mountain range out by the coast. We've also got the Cascade Mountains a little further in from us. So we're like a trough between two mountain ranges. And Puget Sound is part of that trough. And it goes all the way up to around, by Vancouver Island, between Vancouver Island and the mainland to the north. And it goes all the way south, the Willamette Valley in Oregon has the same thing, and it goes down into Northern California. This trough is one big ecosystem, and it's a mosaic of forest and prairie. And the prairie is almost all gone. Almost all of it's gone. It's 99% extinct. And it's because it was a convenient place to put our farms. It was a convenient place to build our cities and our highways. And so, we didn't have to chop down any trees to do it. We just, got the plow out and our horses and oxen and just started digging. And so the result is it's almost entirely gone. And so, this happened before I was born. And when I look around at, even when I go out into quote unquote nature, I'm not seeing the way that it used to be 500 years ago. I'm seeing something so radically transformed that the things I take for granted aren't normal at all. When I was a kid, a small boy, before I entered first grade, I was living in Maple Valley in the southeast of the county, the rural part of the county. And I loved the blackberry bushes. I like to pick the blackberries and eat them. They were delicious. But also they were everywhere. They were growing all over the houses and fences and so on. And what I didn't know is the reason that they're growing everywhere is because they're an invasive species. There is a native blackberry that's much smaller that doesn't do that. But what I was looking at was the European blackberry that had been turned loose in an environment that was never designed for it. And it was like the kudzu of the Pacific Northwest. It was climbing over everything and burying and killing other plants, just drowning them in the volume of itself as it just expanded. I thought it was natural. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I came to understand it was the opposite of natural. It was koyaanisqatsi, life out of balance. And so what you're talking about, Phineas, you really put your finger on it, is that there's the challenge of trying to figure out not just how can I be happy and live a satisfactory life, but how can I engage with the larger world to try to help it regain some of the harmony that it's lost. So, project I'm working on the last year is redoing my backyard to pull out all the European grass and put in the grasses that used to live here. Grasses and flowers. There used to be a lot of native flowers here that the butterflies need. I need to put them back in because the butterflies are almost all gone in Seattle too. And nobody in Seattle knows why. It's like you really have to study to figure out, well, if we take out all their grasses and flowers, what are they going to eat? They can't eat this other stuff. They didn't evolve to eat those things. So there's these concepts, and also the number of birds has vanished in Seattle. It's plummeted 90% during my lifetime. And part of the reason for that is it turns out almost every species of bird can only get to adulthood if its parent feeds it caterpillars when it's in the nest. And where do the caterpillars come from? Well, they need the grasses and the flowers. Well, what happened to the grasses and the flowers? Well, we plowed them under and we planted corn and wheat, and the caterpillars can't live on that. So there's this whole domino effect, in which something as simple as, well, I think I'll put a farm here, and then my neighbor has the same idea, and his neighbor has the same idea. And next thing we know, we don't have any birds. We can't figure out what happened. So there is this larger harmonizing that happens, in our lives, where we can look deeper and say, I could try to harmonize not just with the way of life that has been eliminating the natural world here. I could be a little dissonant with the practices of my neighbors and try to harmonize with the underlying nature that this land wants to be, that it spent millions of years becoming. I could try to help it grow back, regenerate, and harmonize with that and see what happens. So these are interesting issues to wrestle with, all these questions of what does it mean to harmonize? And it goes back, Phil was teasing me last week for quoting Heraclitus more than the other Greeks. And I promise I will be quoting more Greeks as we go forward. I spent a bunch of time reading Thales after last week's call, but I'm going to quote Heraclitus again anyway. And he says, the hidden harmony is best. He says, often the harmony that you want to align with is not the obvious one around you, but something deeper and quieter underneath that. And it involves study and reflection to find that hidden harmony and then say, okay, that's the key I'm going to sing in. And we'll see what happens. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story about the changing environment, in the valley. And it brings to mind, I guess, what I wanted to ask you earlier is that, as man gets more and more developed in his technology and whatever it is, God is getting smaller and smaller. That's what you said. And I kind of disagree in a different sense. I would say God is withdrawing to make room for man to make decisions. And I'm basing this on the Abrahamic religions, not so much the ones in the Far East, because God, at least in the Bible, maybe the Quran is slightly different, but at least in the Bible, and probably which means the Jews and the Christians, God had man in a special place. He made him in his own image, or so the myth says, which means that he understood that in order to give man sort of the power of the demigod, not God, but a demigod, then he has to let him freely exercise his potentiality of understanding change and evolving situations. Whereas most animals are perfectly adapted to what they do, but in a local, long-lasting thing, when the conditions change, they come extinct. But human being has this power to go beyond that and actually see it as a dynamic world that's going on. And so he's withdrawing. It's kind of like God created his children. At some point, he's teaching them, but at some point he has to let them develop on his own. So he has to withdraw his support slowly in the right way. Just like, when you have children, you know, you're not looking over their shoulder forever and screaming at them, even when they're 30 years old or 45. So you withdraw to make room for this in hopes that he would develop and understand the dynamic relationships. But maybe God made a mistake. Maybe we're not as good as we think we are. And maybe God would draw a little too soon when we were merely teenagers. And he said, go to it. You're now free to do whatever you want. I am going to withdraw and allow you to do your thing. And we have made a mess of it because we don't understand the dynamic situation that's ever changing. And so we still think in short term, but with the power of human beings, but short term in the sense that we're still behaving like a lion or tiger or whatever. And so we're wild teenagers running amok, and that we made a mess of it. And maybe God should have just waited a little longer and nurtured us a little more before he said, now I'm going to withdraw and let you become who you are. So I think instead of getting smaller, maybe if there is a God, I'm not sure if there is a God, but there is a God, maybe he is just withdrawing to give space to his children that he made in his own image to do the right thing. And obviously, maybe he would draw a little too early and they're behaving like wild animals, like teenagers would be, rebelling and all that. Okay, that's my thought. I think withdrawing is a better way of saying it than getting smaller. God is as big as ever, but he's going to let it happen, because he made us free to a certain degree. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. I might not have expressed myself very clearly earlier. I wasn't trying to say God literally got smaller, but that there is a misuse of the sacred where we expect God to give us the answers. Why does the sun go around the earth? Why is there day and night? Why? And when we do that, we have defined the sacred in terms of a limited use value. God becomes the answers at the back of the book. And that definition of God is flawed in a lot of ways, but one of them is that God becomes the God of the gaps in our knowledge. And then as we learn more, there are fewer gaps. And therefore to us, if we're misusing the sacred that way, God seems to shrink. And so this is the crisis that was happening during the scientific revolution, is that for too many people, God wasn't an infinite God of inspiration who lives in our hearts and helps us figure out right from wrong. God was the answers at the back of the book, and they needed the answers at the back of the book less and less often. And so it was their misapprehension of God that was causing him to appear to shrink, rather than that he was actually leaving. What you've described with the withdrawal is very close to the deist position of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and others. And the deist position is an attempt to rescue God from the God of the gaps fallacy. But it starts by accepting the God of the gaps premise, and then saying, so maybe what happened is God set up the natural laws of the cosmos and then withdrew to allow the cosmos to work like an intricate clockwork. And so this is the Newtonian God, and the Benjamin Franklin God, and so forth, the deist God, if you will. But there are other traditions. I mean, you can look at the Sufi tradition that says, rather than God being somewhere else looking from a distance, God is everywhere in all things all the time. And this meaning and love is immanent within everything, and it's everywhere. And it's for us to dilate our minds enough to understand it, to appreciate it, and see that it's there. So this is an entirely different approach to the sacred, and it might be closer to a lot of indigenous traditions. In the Book of the Navajo, which is a great book that talks about Navajo culture and religion, it's still really the go-to reference for an introduction. The author talks about how when Europeans first encountered the Navajo, they thought that the Navajo had no religion at all. And they said, well, we have a religion, and the way we know is we have our sacred house, and we go to our sacred house on Sunday mornings and we worship God. And I don't see you with any sacred house, and I don't see you setting aside some time during the week when you pray. And that can only mean that you are less religious than we are. It took Europeans a long time to figure out that they had it exactly backwards. It was that Europeans were much less religious than the Navajo were. Because to the Europeans, God was so small, you could stick him in a house and he'd only be there certain hours of the week. Whereas to the Navajo, the sacred is everywhere all the time. Every single thing you do has sacred implications. You should always slow down and ask yourself the moral significance of the actions that you're going to take. And it's everywhere in Navajo culture. In traditional Navajo culture, you ask a question and nobody will answer you for a while. They'll all go, And it's because they're thinking about it. And we're so used to not thinking about anything that we think that the person who blurts out the first answer that comes to their mind is the intelligent one. But to the Navajo, that's the stupid one. The intelligent one sits back and thinks about it because everything matters. The sacred is everywhere. Like the consequences of things are everywhere. And so they didn't need a special house. that God was in. God was in all the houses and outside the houses and in our hearts. And they didn't need a special time of the week when you go to pray, because God is everywhere all the time. You always have to be paying attention. And this is, I think, one of the implications of one of the 5 pillars of Islam is the praying 5 times a day. And it's 5 times a day specifically so that it will interrupt your busy life and make you stop and go, no matter how busy I get, there are more important things than this. And God is trying to remind me of those things. And if it's in the middle of a business meeting, then we have to interrupt the business meeting, because the business isn't as important as doing the right thing, as remembering the sacred. So there's a similar idea there, right? And this is an alternative to the God of the Gaps. It's I think, a more successful strategy for integrating the sacred into the modern world. Because otherwise you're stuck with either deism or the shrinking God, and neither of those is ultimately satisfactory. So I'm glad you brought it up, Phil, and talked about it. Gulnose, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
In Quran, God refers to himself or herself as us, we. It never says I. Us, we, and I always imagine that they are a group of mad scientists or something. They understand us so well from the beginning, because see, God, Allah, or mad scientists, they are the universal consciousness. They gathered the experience of human beings from the beginning of Adam and Eve, origins of sin. And by the way, when we talk about earlier, the cheetah, oak tree, they are the nature. I'm reading Zarathustra of Nietzsche also. There as well, he's so close to nature. But the problem is, us, we are so much more advanced already. The mad scientists made a amazing project out of us, so we have to embrace it. There is no killing God. I get mad with Nietzsche. Why do you force killing God? We don't have to kill God. God got us here. He's our ally. Let's go with him together. But then, sorry, yeah, I'm going back to the text. There are 2 sentences really stood out for me. I would love to, because see, these sentences, we already went so ahead. They made a huge project out of us. These sentences, I think, pull us backwards. I'll read out. Moral nature is the explanation we detest and we're ashamed of. And sin is generated through spirit. Sin is generated through spirit. Is it that self-flagellation comes from? We have to kill, we have to break the spirit so that spirit doesn't have enough energy to sin anymore. And what is the sin? And that immoral. The immorality comes from the fact that we sinned and we detest ourselves. We are ashamed of ourselves. And I don't know. We came so far. Why are we pulling ourselves backwards again? Why are we ashaming ourselves for things, for our own human experiences?
Thank you, Gulnose. Which text were you citing those 2 sentences from?
It's the same. I think I went down a little bit. I went down the same text somewhere.
Is it the William Blake text, or is it the Kenneth Smith text?
Kenneth Smith.
Okay.
I'm reading Kenneth Smith.
Yeah, I couldn't find it, but I might be looking in the wrong place. So the one thing I'd say about Nietzsche is that quote about God is dead that Nietzsche does, he's not advocating killing God. He's criticizing European Christianity for having no real sense of the sacred in their hearts. During his day in the 19th century in Germany, he saw Christians going to church and going through all the motions, but not actually caring about the sacred, not letting the message of love and caring for the poor, penetrate their hearts. And they went about their lives as though God were dead to them. And he was criticizing the modern world for having lost a sense of the sacred, which he thought that we needed. He was studying the ancient Greeks, who had this sense that everything is sacred. They're sacred all around us, and he saw that the vitality of Greek culture really derived from that sense that things matter, that sense of the sacred. And he said, he's trying to say, if the modern world wants to fix itself, it's going to have to reconnect with that sense of the sacred and the numinous to feel alive again. And you know, until then, you know, in the hearts of Germans who claim to be religious, God is nevertheless dead. That's really what he's trying to say. He's not trying to say you should kill God or anything like that. And we're lucky in this because for many decades after Nietzsche died, we only had bad translations. And there was a guy in the middle of the 20th century, Walter Kaufmann, who got fed up with it. And he did a project and he went through and retranslated all of Nietzsche into English. And it's in his translations and footnotes that he's sort of peeling back these nihilist layers of misinterpretation that the Nazis put on everything, and is showing that the original Nietzsche was not opposed to God and was not an anti-Semite. And he was not a German nationalist. He hated German nationalism. He hated anti-Semitism, and he wanted us to connect to the sacred and to feel alive. And Kaufmann brings all that back in his translation. So I highly recommend when you look at Nietzsche, you want to look at the Walter Kaufmann translations because he helps us to see the original Nietzsche, who was not a critic of religion. He was a critic of modernity. He says modernity has a hard time being authentically religious compared to the medievals had an easier time being authentically religious. The ancients had an easier time being authentically religious. We're uniquely challenged in the modern world in being forced into this shallow, busy life that doesn't give us time to really reflect and connect to the deeper harmony of life. And that hurts us. It makes us, he called us a sick animal. He says it makes us sick to be disconnected like that. We need access to the sacred. We need access to vitality. Anyway, so thanks for bringing that up. It's an essential point. I think, you know, in this, Nietzsche basically agrees with you. So Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, to address something that Phil said, I don't think that God is withdrawing or stepping back. I think we are not having the connection with the sacred, which is what you just said. I don't think God is doing anything. I think he's always there. That's my opinion of it. But I think our participation across all the Abrahamic religions, and I can only speak for Christianity, and if you look at it, a lot of the churches are empty. You know, at Easter and Christmas, they're full, right? But the rest of the time, it's empty. And, you know, all the pastors complain about it. Is our engagement that's changing.
Thank you, Sharon. Excellent point. Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I love how you put it with the reason the Greeks thrived was because of a sense of meaning. Like the vitality of the Greeks came from their sense of meaning. Yeah, I think that's sort of what we're missing right now. Like our perspective on how valuable a human is and how valuable our output is isn't fully expressing right now.
Yes. I always think of Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen and that line, nothing really matters. Anyone can see nothing really matters to me. You know, it's all the terrible things that he's done in that song, you know, the guy and the now he killed a man and now he's gonna, you know, get killed for it, and he's struggling with his emotions and with his life in general, and then the conclusion he comes to is that it feels meaningless. It feels like nothing really matters. And I think for a lot of people in the modern world, the busyness of modern life, fill out your forms, send in, you know, your money by the right date. You know, you gotta open up all the junk mail and make sure that it's junk. You have to open up all the spam email and make sure that it's spam. There's this kind of relentless busyness, and it just doesn't feel like it adds up to a meaningful life. And it's in doing that, you know, Nietzsche and other culture critics are saying that's not just a waste of time. It's a waste of our lives. It's a waste of there's something in Homo sapiens where we need to feel a connection to the things that matter. You know, sometimes I get that by going out into nature, going up onto Mount Rainier, or going to the Grand Canyon, and going someplace that is emotionally and experientially overwhelming, and it shakes up my life. and drives out the stupid busyness and reconnects me to the greater harmony for just a little bit. And when I feel that, it's like a rush of life. It's like when you're really thirsty, that first cup of water is amazing. It's like, this is what I needed. There's something in us that when you plug into the thing that you really, really needed, your heart rewards you and says, yes, you're doing it. This is the thing you should have been doing. When how good is that first meal when you after a fast, when you break your fast? And I know this is a thing in Islam that Muslims get to experience every year. They get to experience this going through you do the fast and then you break the fast and you're reminded. Your body says, yes, this is what you're supposed to be doing. You get the control over your life through the deprivation that you do on purpose, and you learn not to be a prisoner to your desires. But then you also get the reward of, I reconnect to my needs and do the right thing. And my body says, yes, that's it. You're a healthy animal, not a sick animal. You're a healthy animal. This is what you do. And people who don't ever fast never get to experience that, either side of it. They become prisoners of their appetites on the one hand, and then but it becomes meaningless and rote. They never get that reward of coming back after a fast and going, oh, ooh, this is the best date I've ever eaten in my life. It's amazing. It's an ordinary date, but it's also the best date. It's like, anyway, the human body and the human mind wants us to have those peak experiences. We are designed to feel them. And it's criminal if we organize modern life in such a way that we never get to feel that everything is just drudgery and repetition and being a cog in a machine. That's not what we evolved to do. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so Nietzsche's God is dead. I've spent a bit of time with this one. And of course, you reflect on the people who Nietzsche appreciated, like Schopenhauer. Well, Schopenhauer has an aspect of genius in him. You had some others. You had Feuerbach and David Strauss, who had all influenced Nietzsche. But Schopenhauer was the one he was probably most impressed by. But, there's a level of genius there. And Schopenhauer hated religion, particularly the Christian religion. And he couldn't wait until it was eradicated. And he felt philosophy could be a replacement for religion. Religion's just silly, primitive nonsense, and philosophy is what people can engage in. And Nietzsche, of course, turns around on this and thinks, well, how stupid can you get? Well, the question came, Kant points out. So we have two things. We have facts, like scientific facts, objective facts, and we have internal values, values that can't be scientifically justified. And Nietzsche says, well, then as Kant said, the two things which inspire me are the starry heavens above and the moral law within. He's referring to the workings of external nature, which science can work on, and then to the moral law within, which really science can't really reach any determinations there. There's the Hume's gap is there. And Nietzsche's the one that realised, well, God used to be the guarantee for the Christian. The God which made the external world and its facts was the same God that created the internal values. But if God is dead, we're left with science, we're left with objective facts, but the internal values are dead as well, because there's no guarantee for them. And it's seemingly, apparently, our values were created because a load of people had faith in something which didn't exist. So is there a value in having faith in something which doesn't exist? Is there value in having faith in a lie? But his point was, so the world of science has taken over and God's dead and the underpinning of values are gone. Well, he felt, they're just standing around, these philosophers, they're just standing around congratulating themselves, Schopenhauer and David Strauss and Feuerbach. Oh, we don't need God, we have values. And Nietzsche's trying to say that what you're feeling as values is simply a product of the past when people did believe, when they did have faith. And you're like a warm rock. But as time passes, that rock's going to grow cold. All those habits that were the product of faith are going to die out in Western civilization, for example, and be replaced by nihilism unless you find an answer which really does work. And he said Nietzsche was profoundly disturbed by this. How could all these clever men, like Schopenhauer and David Strauss and Feuerbach, they missed it. As clever as they were, they missed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's a nice summary of the context behind the God is dead statement, and it's important. And and I guess the other thing about Nietzsche that one learns from Kaufman and elsewhere is it's very dangerous to take him out of context, because his philosophy was a journey, and he changed his mind over time. He changed his mind in a big way. So early in his career, he was enamored of Schopenhauer, but then, as Stephen points out, he reaches this crisis where he goes, "Wow, Schopenhauer's really wrong about this. What is the basis for our value system?" He says it can't just be reason. Reason isn't enough. You can reason yourself into or out of any position, depending on your logic. And values can't be that fragile. And what is to keep people from cannibalizing each other or creating death camps and exterminating millions of people? What prevents that from happening? It has to be that we have a strong framework of attachment to life and vitality. We have to have an attachment to healthy behavior. And in the past, that attachment came from our relationship to the sacred. But if we throw that out, as the modern world is saying it's going to do, and then we tell ourselves that from then on we can just reason our way to right and wrong, Nietzsche says, I fear where this is leading. This is going to lead us somewhere sick. Some bad things are going to happen. He like Brahms, he had this sense that he couldn't fully put into words that something really ugly was brewing in Germany during his lifetime, and that Germany was going to go on to do something terrible. He hated the German nationalism. He hated the anti-Semitism. He criticizes Germany relentlessly. He says, German philosophers have this ability to be incredibly well educated and intelligent and yet completely miss the point. And he says, I don't know if it's that they're drunk all the time. He says there's way too much beer in German philosophy. He says, I don't know, whether it's the disconnect from religion or what it is, but that there's this threat. And of course, neither of them exactly said, yes, in the 1930s and 40s, they're going to create a Holocaust, but they both sort of forecast that something really ugly was coming. And Nietzsche's critique of Schopenhauer and Feuerbach and Strauss is...
Well, values say you can't eat babies.
Right.
But fact says, well, actually you can eat babies and they're rather tasty.
right. And Nietzsche's saying, you can't use reason alone to talk yourself out of eating babies. You really need a moral framework here. I'm really concerned about where these ultra rationalism is going to take us, says Nietzsche. We need something deeper than just the human reason to keep us out of bad behavior. So thanks for that, Stephen. And I'm gonna call on Phil in a second, but first I want to point us at this third quote from Blake, which is relevant to this discussion we've had for the last half hour, which is, man can have no idea of anything greater than man, as a cup cannot contain more than its capaciousness. And of course, what he's talking about here is the difficulty that human beings have in understanding the sacred, or even nature, right? But what does it mean to do the right thing? What is the nature of the sacred? What is this deeper harmony that we're supposed to be connecting to, and how does it work? And the problem is, as the ancient Greeks saw, the tendency human beings have is to see things like through a warped lens, and then assume that the distorted image that results from that is the truth. And the warpage happens in a lot of ways. It can happen for ideological reasons. It can happen from, cognitive illusions, from a trick of perspective that we just miss some things. But ultimately, one of the worst problems is that we're just not that smart. We'd only live 60, 70, 80 years. That's not very long compared to, billions of years of the universe. We don't get to see very much of what's going on around us. And even during that time, most of us don't travel very much. We aren't very educated. We're very parochial. And so we have a tendency, when we're confronted with these great, infinite, important things like the sacred or the natural, we have a tendency to turn them into little cartoons that can fit inside our tiny pin brains and then say, there, that's God. And Blake's like, no, that's not God. That is God. This is our little cartoon picture of God. And we must not confuse them with each other, because this thing is trivial by comparison with that thing. We must always recognize there's something deeper and more profound going on. And that we have to carry that humility and wonder around inside of us that makes us appreciate that we're in the midst of great things. This is what he's alluding to with this quote. And so there's a relationship between this quote and the Greek concept of the bed of Procrustes, that what makes Procrustes a villain instead of a good host is that he insists on fitting everybody to his bed. If they're too tall, he cuts parts off of them. And if they're too short, he stretches them on it like a rack. And in either way, he's doing violence to the people he's supposed to be a good host to. You have to let things be what they actually are and not distort them to fit the bed of your mind, or in Blake's case, the cup of our mind, right? And that's one of the hardest parts we have in trying to be good people and to understand the world, is that tendency to think that it's okay to squash things down to fit our preconceptions. Think that's fine, when in fact we're doing violence to the world and violence to the sacred. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, part of the problem with human civilization is technology has done such wonderful things, and we think that everything is positive. We're getting more and more efficient, the whole bit. But I wonder whether we see that technology has actually not only changed our political and social structures in a sense, because when you invent a train or plane, the world changes, I mean, you experience the world in a different way. And it seems to me the downside of technology is that, well, I'm going to go back to your cup analogy. It almost seems like technology is the cup that can brimmeth over. And the problem is that human beings actually need other human beings. We need connections. And we have a replacement for on-site, hand-to-hand interaction with the fact that we have a technology. In fact, my nephew says, like, why don't you have a cell phone? I said, I just don't want to have a phone and get all that busy. And he says, well, everybody in the third world has a cell phone. And I said, I guess I live in the fourth world because I don't want that kind of connection. But on the other hand, it just seems like almost everybody believes that, it's like they can't miss a moment on the cell phone because they will be disconnected. And so it almost seemed like a spectacle replacement for being on-site relationships. And so we have become bounded by the cup of technology in a sense. And then it's changing our social interactions. We don't think of social interaction as like, going out to lunch with somebody or whatever anymore. It's just like, like how many hits do you have, on the internet, that kind of thing. How many memes do you gather that to prove that you are popular, that sort of, it just seems like technology does such wonderful things, but I think we need to also see how, in some sense, it's also displays our normal relationship with others, and also a political situation. It's you know, when I watch the movie, what is it? The movie of the guy who invented atomic bomb, and at the end he says,
Oppenheimer.
was Truman called him into the office, to congratulate him, thank you for inventing the atomic bomb, because we ended the war in that. And he started equivocating, yeah, but I feel really guilty. And Truman says, get that bastard out of my office. In other words, you did the positive thing, now you're feeling guilty because you invented something that would change the world. And he did, And so in some sense, like, yeah, what seemed to be good could always turn out to be bad. But on the other hand, if you live a primitive life, like the Aboriginals, the American Indians, for instance, the fact is that you got almost wiped out because you didn't have a technology. So that's also important for your survival, right? In other words, oh, you got arrows and spears and you have a horse, but we got tanks and guns. Like, get the hell out of Dodge. That's how it goes, like, so therefore, yeah. So on the one hand, we depend on it, because on the other hand, if we don't have it, oh, you could be wiped out no matter how virtuous you might be. You're dead. Doesn't do you any good if you're dead. I remember I was working at the Lower Museum of Anthropology, and I printed a lot of pictures of Ishi, the last living Indian of his tribe. It was very touching. I really find him to be a hero of his, but he was the last man. Could you imagine how he felt? His tribe would die with him. And he was busy trying to like work with Dr. Krober. He said, could you make me a canoe? I said, yeah. He says, of course. He made a canoe because that's only left the remnants of his tribe, and he's the last one. Could you imagine the weight that in his shoulder, but he still, and he operated fairly efficiently in the modern world. He had a stove and all that. He had an apartment in San Francisco and traveled to Berkeley. But he always boiled water like his mother taught him. Heat up a large rock and put it in the water. I said, wow, I like his allegiance to his tradition, in spite of the fact that he knows the technology. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. It's a double-edged sword, is what I'm saying. The technology has a good side, but we don't understand enough how it has the bad side, and changes our whole human relationship to each other. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, the trap. Trap. If you don't go along with it, you lose. If you do go along with it, then we all lose, because we're doing a way of life that's not sustainable, but we're forcing people into it, so they don't have a choice. This is the modern world in a nutshell. It's a trap. So this quote that we did from Blake, I'm going to call on Phineas in just a second. I just wanted to add that reference to the cup and what it can contain. It put me immediately in mind of the Zen parable of the teacup, and I shared the link in the chat. I first encountered that in my traditional Okinawan karate classes as a child, and it's about a guy who really desperately wants to become enlightened. He wants to learn. He's sort of this great Zen master, and he travels a long way to get there. And the Zen master welcomes him and says, "Oh, I'm glad to hear you're interested in enlightenment." And he sit down, have a cup of tea. And he puts the teacup out and he starts pouring the tea, and then he just keeps pouring until it fills up and is spilling over. And the guy, and he knows this is a wise man, and he's trying to be polite, but eventually he just can't take it anymore. He bursts out and says, "Stop! You're pouring tea all over the place." And he says, "Well, Yeah, because that's you. You come here with your head so full, there's no room for anything else. How are you going to learn wisdom when you think you've already got it? Well, your head's already full. There's no room. You gotta empty your teacup if you want to learn. And the guy goes, "Oh." and little 11-year-old me sitting on the floor of my dojo goes, I see.
Yeah, I have a funny story to tell in some sense, because like in another meeting, somebody says, imminent enlightenment was before enlightenment, there was the mountains. After the enlightenment, there's the mountains. I said that's not true in West Virginia. Before the enlightenment, there was the mountains. After enlightenment, there was only the mountain cut off. The
Yes.
technology, the mountain has disappeared.
Yes.
I live in West Virginia. So
Yes.
so after enlightenment, there is no mountain. It's, oh God, like there's no more mountain anymore.
Sadly. Thank you, Phil. Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm glad you made that teacup analogy because it directly relates to this. This was also parallel to the idea with Schopenhauer and the God of the gaps, where when physicists were first uncovering quantum mechanics, they were going to, like Einstein, he was going to universities and trying to get a position. But the physicists at the time thought that physics was basically figured out. So to go and get a degree in physics was kind of a waste of time because they'd solved, how to throw a ball and how to calculate water pouring down a hill. So they figured they sort of solved everything. But then it turned out there's like a whole another level to it, and it just branches infinitely after that. And so it's the same thing with the philosophers. You think you've got it at the edge, you think God's not relevant, and then it turns out it goes way deeper than the edge we've built up.
Yes, yes. The fractal quality of nature, right? It's like you want to draw a map of North America. You sit down and you go, okay, well, there's a map. It's like, well, that's pretty good, but let's start using some tools and measure the coastline. You realize you drew a straight line where it should have been crinkly. So, okay, so you replace the straight line with a crinkly line, and that makes it longer, right? It goes in and out instead of being straight. And then you realize, oh, all the lines have to be fixed like that. So you go around the coast again, and it's now the coast is longer because it's full of all these crinkly edges. And it's not the same length coast that it was when you drew the first map. You go, okay, now I've got it. It's like, okay, that's great. Well, now let's get even closer. Let's start get in a plane and map it. And then you realize, wow, I still was oversimplifying it. And you start trying to fix all of the places you oversimplify. The more detail you go into, the longer the coastline gets. There's more inlets and bays, and there's more bulges, and there's, those two are crinkly. It's like the Mandelbrot set. It's just the more you dive in, the more detail you see. And
yeah, exactly like that. Great. Yeah, great analogy.
And it's unsettling, right? Because, we're taught in school is you have to have the answer to get the A. So we want an answer. But of course, reality doesn't work that way. Any answer we can say is a gross oversimplification. And the real important thing to understanding reality isn't to have the answer, but to be endlessly curious and to always know whatever answer I have is a gross approximation of reality. It's not even close. So, it's like, how do you deal with this teacup problem that the brain doesn't have room to hold nature, which is infinite, or the sacred, which is infinite? Or as Heraclitus says, you can't even understand your whole self because your character is effectively infinite. You spend the rest of your life trying to figure out who the hell you are, and as you're doing that, you're getting older and more sophisticated, and your soul is dilating, and so it's getting deeper as you're trying to follow its paths, and you die before you get more than just a vague sense of who you are, a vague sense of who God is, and that's not a problem as long as you know that you have that issue, that it's all more profound than we understand it to be. It only becomes a problem when we think we have all the absolute answers. We start telling other people, no, this is the answer. Yeah, I'm right and you're wrong. It's like, well, it's a lot more complicated than one guy's right and one guy's wrong.
Well, not to overstep, but this is just like the story in the Bible where they're on the boat and they're all standing on the boat, all stable, and then Jesus just like walks out onto the water because it was actually possible to do that if you like believed he could do it. So yeah, most people are in the situation where they want to have the answers and they just stay on the boat.
Yes.
But actually, it's possible to go beyond that.
Yeah, the water's so much bigger than just the boat. Yeah, the boat's another good metaphor, right? It's a kind of cup, but it's a cup that's excluding all of the important parts. And if it didn't exclude it, it'd sink. But so how do you bring in the infinite and not drown in it? It's a challenge. So this next quote, I'm gonna call on Phil in a second. This next Blake quote from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The worship of God is honoring his gifts in other men, each according to his genius, and loving the greatest men best. Those who envy or calumniate great men hate God, for there is no other God. This is the kind of thing that during the peak Middle Ages you could have been burnt for saying this, right? I mean, this is definitely against the Orthodox medieval Christian European position. They say, of course, God is not limited to the expression within human beings. The medievals believed in a God who made miracles happen whenever he wanted to, all the time. They didn't believe in the idea that God expresses himself through human beings who are striving to follow his example and to be empty vessels for, for what God wants. They didn't believe that. They thought that was part of the picture, but it was important to them to have an omnipotent God who could do miracles at all times. And so what Blake's talking about, for there is no other God than that, is exactly the sort of thing that would get you executed in the Middle Ages. I mean, you weren't allowed to say that. So what we're seeing in this quote that Kenneth has selected for us to introduce chapter 6 is we're seeing a highly atypical position, post-medieval and anti-medieval orthodoxy. But again, it wasn't unheard of during the medieval epoch. There were, Muslim and Jewish and Christian and Chinese and Japanese and other, mystics who really did feel this way, that the working of God on earth takes place from people choosing to align with God and trying to make a better world, to do the right thing. And that's where the sacred lies. And that's the most important thing, is to try to help people to listen to the better angels of their nature and do good in the world. And so, first of all, that's really atypical. The other thing I really wanted to point out about this fourth quote is, remember that the ancients believed in hierarchies. The ancients believed that some people are better than other people, because the ancients thought that was the basis of your political system. The better people should run things, and the inferior people should obey the better people. That was their whole political structure. Whether it's a monarchy or an aristocracy or a democracy, that only changes how many people are the better people. You've still got everybody else, and their job is to listen. And that the medieval revolution, which we talked about in chapter 5, was based on overthrowing this idea, because they're looking at ancient Rome and how corrupt the Roman Empire is and going, your better people are the worst people. You don't have an aristocracy, you have a kakistocracy. The shittiest people are in charge. You couldn't pick worse people. This is as bad as it gets. So, I've had it up to here with your hierarchy, say the church father. The church fathers are saying, what we want to see is a brotherhood of man. How about we all stop pretending we're better than each other? What if we all just, help each other through this struggle in life to do the best we can? And each of us will, try to become a better person tomorrow than we were yesterday. And nobody's going to pretend that they're done, or that they're the best, or they're the winner. The brotherhood of man was a central organizing principle of early Christianity. And you see elements of it in Islam as well, right? This notion that we're all equal under Islam, that this is a religion of love, and that we're all going to take care of each other. It's part of why one of the pillars of Islam is taking care of each other, giving, to each other. That nobody gets to hoard it all and be the winner who has all the stuff. You see this in lots of religions. When they get to the spiritual mode, they talk about this idea of a brotherhood of man. But here in this Blake quote, this is the opposite of a brotherhood of man. This is back to the ancient idea of hierarchies and priorities, saying some people are just nicer than other people. Some people are just smarter than other people. Some people are more artistic than other people. Some people are faster runners than other people. There is a diversity to be found in human beings. And our job is not to stamp that out and pretend it doesn't exist. Our job is to recognize that diversity and honor it and say, if God wanted everybody to be equal, maybe he would have made them equal. And instead, he made some of them better musicians than others. Some of us are tone deaf and others have perfect pitch. And if you're trying to put a choir together, maybe the tone deaf people should, shut up and let the perfect pitch people set the initial note. The last thing that the choir needs is me with my tone deafness going, let's all sing together. It's like, no, shut up, Rick. Let that other person set the note, right? He's basically talking in about a meritocracy here. And he's talking about diversity. He's talking about these core values that were ancient values, but were not the original medieval values. So where does this come from? What is Blake doing with this, with these ideas? And, part of it is, remember, this is post-Renaissance. So there has been, in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, Blake's writing, 1800s, 1900s. By the time you get to Blake, Europe has had it with people pretending that we're all equal, when in fact that pretense was being used to collect massive amounts of gold, for rulers and for a corrupt papacy, in the 1500s. The Renaissance is based on the idea: what if we stop pretending that the people in charge are honestly representing the best and the brightest? What if we go back to the original Greek and Latin and other ancient sources and see what they had to say? Ad fontes is the motto of the Renaissance. Back to the sources and go see what the original sources were. And when we do that, we see this celebration of excellence that says, yeah, you should totally let the fastest person run faster than the slowest person. We all shouldn't be moving at the pace of the person on crutches. Everybody should move at their own pace. You should have a society that allows people to develop in different directions and in different ways. And otherwise, you'll never have a great artist or a great musician or a great generous person who gives greatly. Everything will become mediocre and insipid as everything gets turned into a stamped out average. So that idea, even though it was rediscovered during the Renaissance, it never really died out during the medieval epoch. There were always mystics here or there who recognized that lots of people who pretend to be religious are shallow, but if you search, you'll find people who are authentic and that they genuinely care about doing the right thing and heeding the sacred, and that you should listen more to those people than you do to the people who don't care and who aren't paying attention. And all of this is subtext of what he's talking about here. You got to pay attention to those differences. So this is a repudiation of the dominant orthodoxy of the power structures of the medieval epoch. And it's appealing to these mystical traditions that go back thousands of years into the ancient epoch. So again, it's interesting, right? Because in chapter 5, our focus was what was the typical, official canonic position of medievalism. But now in chapter 6, we're really getting some of the mystical traditions, some of the other half of the dialectic, some of the ideas that were incompatible with the ideas of the power structure, or at least with the propaganda that it poured out on people, and that these are trying to get to a deeper, more authentic spirituality that's closer to God. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, last night I saw a very, very interesting video about the cosmos. And I'm going to talk about it in relationship to the double-edged relationship of technology and the cup overfloweth. Okay. And some mathematicians have predicted for quite a long time that planet 9X exists, but they never found it. They never found it. But there's a lot of indications that it exists. What happened was recently, quantum computing has checked all the data that the telescope, what is it, the the latest telescope produced, and they found an anomaly, and they looked at it and analyzed it with a quantum computer, And they saw that not an absolute proof, but a pretty confirmed proof that planet 9 actually exists. And planet 9 exists very, very far away beyond the heliosphere, in the Oort cloud, which is, I guess, still influenced by the sun's gravity, which means that it exists in relationship to a lot of asteroids that exist in the Oort cloud. And when a comet that comes in, that falls in once in a while, it takes something like 30,000 years for it to make an orbit in the world, which is something you couldn't actually even predict in a way. And what it shows is that there's enough relationship within the asteroids in the Oort cloud that something is there, and they detected it at the James Webb Telescope. But nobody actually was able to analyze the data except for quantum computing. Now, what I mean the cup overfloweth in this sense is that quantum computing is not a true representation of the world as it is, of the cosmos as it is, but a very close proximity of what it is. In other words, when you increase the tidbits within the quantum computing, it is better and better in predicting the probabilities of something that's real. So in some sense, like what frightened me, I was excited by that discovery. In other words, they almost absolutely prove it. And otherwise, a lot of world telescope is now pointing at that particular location to see if it actually could see it. But what frightens me is that the human beings are a desire to go beyond the cup, which is wisdom, and actually be able to transcend and make the cup overflow. And what frightens me is not that they could make discoveries, because that's a very positive part in terms of human understanding. But if quantum computing could do this, it would displace human beings, because we only have wisdom, and wisdom within a cup is really what the limited mind is able to call strategy, strategical thinking, which is to simplify the minute thinking of and give it sort of some parameters of understanding that's somewhat vague. And that goes back to my a long time ago, I read Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, in which the German Central Command, the high office, had the strategy all worked out for World War I. Right? They knew everything. They knew where every boxcar was located, how it's going to move. They knew all the way to do it. And when the war started, of course, things changed. And the field officers kept calling back the Central Command, says, things are not turning out the way you said it would be, because they were actually on the ground looking at the tactics, how the tactic is developing, a much more micro understanding of the situation at hand. Okay, what quantum computing, in fact, not that they have consciousness, is that advanced tactics is superior to strategy. That right away throws a monkey wrench in the limitation of the cup. Because we as human beings, with our limitations, have developed a strategy of thinking in broad ways, but not understanding the details of a situation at hand. And quantum computing is getting to the point that its tactical moves, and you could prove this in chess and in Go, is good enough to at least beat strategic thinking. And that's a frightening aspect for human beings. Because and imagine if it could actually achieve consciousness, we're in a lot of trouble. But even without that, it's like advanced tactics is already superior to strategic thinking, which means a very smart guy has lost his job in inventing things and doing factory work or whatever, because the machines will take over. This is what frightens me, despite the fact that there was a positive result of understanding. So the double-edged sword of technology, this is the same thing, you know. The American Indians were living well, living comfortably, everything is fine, except, you know, they couldn't face up to the technology of the gun. And so I am frightened of the future. I mean, it will pass. I will pass by, no problem. I'm going to die before then. But it's like I'm actually frightened for the humanity, because it doesn't depend on wisdom. Wisdom is a poor strategy compared to advanced tactics. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's an interesting statistic that the generations now alive in the United States in the last few decades for the first time are confident that their own children will do worse than they did. Up until now, they've always believed that their children would do better, but it's just increasingly clear, you know, everything's just too expensive. Everything's just too hard. You know, you go bankrupt trying to get an education, you go bankrupt trying to get healthcare, you go bankrupt trying to get a house. It's just insane right now. Our economy isn't working. And if you add on to that, pulling the rug out from underneath the profit motive, you know, we're supposed to work hard, because if we do a good job, then we're supposed to have better income. And by having better income, we're more likely to be able to pay our bills. But if an AI can beat us, or quantum computing can beat us no matter how hard we try, then that entire motivation for trying hard disappears. It's like, well, you'll never beat the AI, and it's effectively free for the employer. So now he can have 100% profit and no expenses. So what's your purpose? Nothing. They want you to consume without giving you any money to consume with. The entire producer-consumer framework begins to fall apart in this premise. And it's always been a tricky balancing act. It's part of what the U.S. Civil War was fought over, slavery versus industrialization. Both sides didn't care to compete against the other side. They're like, oh, well, this isn't going to work if I have to fight against you guys. So let's just fight. Let's just have there be only one of us. But this goes deeper than that. This goes right into the fundamental framework of motivation and why should people even participate in the system. If it can't meet human needs, then human beings aren't motivated to continue it anymore. And that starts to echo the case in the late Roman Empire, when people are like, well, why should I fight back these barbarians when the people living under their governments are better off than I am under the Roman Empire? I'd rather the Roman Empire collapsed, because, you know, then I would fall upwards into barbarism, since the barbarians live better than I do. You know, who wouldn't want that? So yeah, this is that thing that happens in the late stages of an epoch, when basically the powers that be start to eat their own corn seed. You know, they start to undo the core social contracts that justify the continuation of the society in which they're thriving. So Gulnose, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm more positive and optimist. Maybe it's not the cup, maybe it is energy. Spinoza talked about energy. I think Einstein said, I want to believe in Spinoza's God. Was it so? It's all energy. We just have to tap into the source of some kind of energy that gets us through. Maybe we're going to end up in that vicious cycle. How are we going to exit? I'm reading right now George Bataille in I think he got it from Robert Musil, most probably. He mentions art, science, and politics. The only way to exit that vicious circle is art, science, politics for human being. So, and by the way, people who complain about technology nowadays, they remind me of the same people of Nietzsche. We have to kill God. For me, somehow I see the comparison between technology and God. Why? They are all our allies. They are helping us. Why are we not playing along? Or learn to control. When you cannot control your own cell phone, you're doing such an injustice to yourself, not to the cell phone. Cell phone is nothing. It doesn't have anything, cannot control over you. You yourself losing control over the tool is given to you. If you're saying no to cell phone, let's say no to, I don't know, the washing machine, oven. Let's go back to the cave. Let's start traveling between countries on camels. Yeah, why? We came so far. There is God, there is technology. We are much stronger than before. So I think there's nothing to complain about. The only thing is stay as human as possible. But yeah, that another question is what is human and how we can stay. The same George Bataille's art, science, and politics will get us through. I'm positive.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Gulnaz. Yeah, I mean, it's this the thing about a tool is that the hammer can be used to build a house or to hit your neighbor over the head. And so really the problem isn't the hammer. The problem is can we agree not to hit each other over the head and to build houses for each other instead, you know? And this is where the issue is with technology. Now I've worked in the computer field for 41 years now, in medical software. And one of the things that computer programmers, who are often very excited about computers, rarely spend much time thinking about is how the biggest large-scale use of computers was the Holocaust. That's what those numbers on the arms of the Jewish prisoners was for. That was their numbers in the IBM computers. IBM made its big money, it made its big breakthrough by selling computers to the Nazis to keep track of the people they were exterminating. So this, you know, the computer can be used to liberate information and to free us, or it can be used to imprison us. And it all depends on, you know, who's picked up the computer and are they feeling helpful or are they feeling harmful, you know? So we all of these issues that we're talking about today go right to the heart of the current existential problem, which is, can we use our powers for good? Will we talk to each other and agree, you know, to do our best not to hurt each other? Or is our need to hurt each other so strong that every gift we put in our hands gets turned into a weapon? It's interesting because I don't know if everyone here has seen Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, but it's from the 1960s, and it shows the enormous breakthrough when, you know, apes learn to pick up a bone or a stick and use it as a weapon. And that's the great triumphal moment in the film early on, is when the ape is smashing all the bones with the stick. And then he throws the stick in the air, and then it cuts thousands of years into the future to a space station gliding among the stars, which is just it's a big version of a stick, right? But we've learned to use it for more than hitting each other with, is Kubrick's argument. But if we weren't being violent against, Kubrick has that mid-20th century idea, if it weren't for the violence of technology, we never would have developed the peaceful side of technology, or so he thinks. And then you contrast that with Margaret Mead's perspective, which is that the earliest sign of civilization isn't a tool. The earliest sign of civilization is a bone that was broken and is healed, because people in the old days could only survive because other people took care of them. And it's that caring that's the foundation of civilization that makes us want to use the stick or the bone not to hit each other with, but to make a crutch or a splint, you know, to support each other. And so this question of how is it to be used, you know, this goes really right to the heart of where we are with technology. As you point out, we have all these powers that can be used for good if we just can commit to that. You know, we can give up the short-term thinking that says, well, I just want to beat my neighbor no matter what. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
About computers, I'm a non-believer. And when the public broadly has come to believe that computers can think, because the media is telling them all that time, and of course, if you convince them that this product does a lot more than it really does, you can sell a lot more to them. But from what I understand, yes, computers are very useful, but computers basically just catalog information, which can be very handy because they can do it very fast. In the old days, if I wanted some information, I'd have to pull somebody out of the office, go to the library, look for all the catalogues. They'd be spending at least a day, if not days, if not weeks, trying to find something. Well, with online, with a search engine, you can grab a whole load of stuff that you need in seconds. And yes, the guy who likes sitting around the library's lost his job. And when it comes to say, this idea that somehow, well, computers can do better than people, yes, they can, because they can bring a whole load of information together, which, if it was just humans doing it, maybe it'd take 100,000 years. I don't know. But it's just simply cataloguing. It's not actually thought as we conceive it. I was just going to say something else that, bringing back the old argument of the centrifugal and the centripetal. That, when you think about positivism, was, the Vienna Circle, they were practicing a sort of a centripetal attitude. These are the limits. We're only going to deal with the positive. We're going to draw a line in the sand and say everything over this side matters and the rest is nothing. And this is part of the aspect of the centripetal. So it's also useful and it's also misleading.
Yeah.
And this is a question, look, Blake seems to have gone back to being a monotheist in this paragraph you're alluding to. He's suddenly decided it's just God now. And okay, but how would that work if there were different gods? So, this genius over there in the enemy tribe is gifted by an enemy god. So we can eliminate him because that's the works of what is for us the evil god. But yeah, it's a question of hierarchy, that what is equality? There's been a lot of arguments about it lately. Jordan Peterson railing against the idea of equality of outcome. But yeah, I know a lot of welfare ideas. I used to be a lefty and I used to believe in sort of an absolute welfare, and then I did a lot of study. And it's stuff that can work in the immediate. But the universe is chaos, it evolves. And when you create a welfare state, suddenly people that don't need welfare find, well, I can just have an easy ride. And worse, the capitalists suddenly find the great side of welfare, that they can create all these consultancies for your welfare efforts. So it ends up like Oliver Twist, with about, 10 cents out of a dollar making it to the people that need it. And, capitalism is just enriching itself out of the welfare, and suddenly realised we were mistaken. The welfare state's magnificent. We can make so much money out of it. And the government, they're not a very discriminating buyer. If we had to deal with private companies, they're in it for a profit and they're a bit discriminating. But the government, you can sell them anything and they'll buy it. But I just thought I'd bring up that problem with the centripetal and centrifugal. And I wonder if it applies somewhere in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phineas, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking similar, and also making the connection to the there's a polarity of the technology. There's like the good side of it and there's the bad side of it. And the connection I was making with that is in Chinese medicine, they like break up different organs to have different emotions. And so the liver is always associated with anger. But I heard someone break it down on a polarity where like it's associated with anger, but it's also associated with compassion, because somehow the anger at someone helps you have compassion for them. He broke it down more eloquently, but so there's like two sides to each of these things. And I guess I just like what you were saying about how with technology, it's like the evil of it helps you see the potential for the good of it, or helps these things be created, which was also reminding me about the like, you know, devil on your shoulder, angel on your shoulder, and how everything sort of, it all comes together. It's all like one package. So we just need to be able to play with both sides and hopefully move more towards the good side.
Thank you, Phineas. Sharon had to leave early today, so she won't be here to applaud when I say I'm going to take us back to the text. But she would, so we can just, you know, sort of mentally applaud on Sharon's behalf. There's a couple of fragments, a couple of quotes by Blake left before we get back to Kenneth Smith's text. And his first one is unusual. The fifth fragment is ages are all equal, but genius is always above the age. It obviously comments upon and follows the fourth fragment where he's talking about different gifts and different people, God, you know, God-given different gifts and different people, and that it's a sacred duty to care about the, you know, the what he's calling genius, which is when people, you know, whether it's for music, whether it's for gardening, or whatever it's for, when people have that spark inside them that makes them want to exceed the average, that makes them want to try harder and do better. We have to honor that. Says Blake, it's a sacred duty. So this is what he's got to be commenting on when he says ages are all equal, but genius is always above the age. The point of what he's calling genius is that it's about doing the atypical thing. It's about trying harder at something and not doing what everybody else is doing, but pushing more in a more obsessive, more focused, more creative way than most people do in order to unfold this, whatever the gift is within you that Blake says in comment 4 is coming from God, that the Greeks thought was coming from nature, because nature produces people differentially. So there's another thing that one can comment on about this, and I don't know if it's what Blake meant or not, but it's something Kenneth Smith said before, which is that the pursuit of excellence is something you can recognize cross-culturally. When you see someone who has that need to push the boulder uphill, you know, to quote, to paraphrase the example of Sisyphus, when you see someone who has that itch to try harder and especially to question their own worldview and their own ideology and their own assumptions, to go further. It doesn't matter what religion they have or what era they're in or what place on earth they are. You know, if you've got that same itch, you recognize it in the others. It's like a harmonizing musical note. You see it happening in front of you, and it's unmistakable. There's a channel called NHK, which comes out of Japan. It's free access. You can look for it on the internet. And NHK produces all of these short, and I mean ultra short documentaries. Some of them are just 2 minutes long or 7 minutes long or what have you. And they're about the pursuit of excellence. It'll be like, you know, this guy is a peach farmer, and his dad was a peach farmer, and his grandpa was a peach farmer, and his great grandpa was a peach farmer. And let's go interview him for 15 minutes and see how he does peach farming. And then you discover he doesn't do a single thing the way everybody else does it. Like he trains the branches of the peaches not to grow above a certain point, but instead to spread out just a little bit above head height. And they've got little, little steps you can step up onto and reach any peach produced by any of the trees. They're all within reach. And then he uses that to take care of the peaches. He'll get rid of some of the peaches when they're young, so the tree will put more energy into the remaining peaches, and he gets these giant, ripe, lush, juicy, just delicious peaches off this tree that most people can't produce because they just don't care that much. They don't try that hard. They haven't refined their approach to growing a peach tree generation after generation after generation, tactically, to use Phil's comment, it's Phil's terminology, focusing on what actually happens with the peach tree. These guys are obsessive, and you don't have to be a peach farmer to watch this and go, oh my God, that's genius. It's somebody who really, really cares about doing a great job, and he's pouring his creativity into making it happen. It's astonishing. And so NHK just all day long is just throwing off these little micro shows one after another after another. Here's a baker. Here's somebody who does microsurgery. He can knit severed nerves together. He can stitch them back together. Here's it's just the full range of walks of life. Here's a welfare officer who really, really cares about the people they take care of. Here's somebody who's competing in the financial market. Let's see how he does it. It's like Japan has a real interest in the cultivation of genius, and it reminds one of this Blake comment and of the sorts of things Kenneth Smith is saying all the time.
Can you link that documentary series? I tried to find it, but I'm not sure if it was the right one.
The channel's called NHK. It's a Japanese channel, and it's in English. It's a Japanese channel in English. So it's like the Japanese equivalent of the BBC or BBC America, right? Google NHK channel Japan, and you should be able to find access. And they have lots of different programs. I'll give you another example. There's a guy who is a fantastic videographer and photographer. He's been on the cover of National Geographic. And what he decided to do with his money and fame is he wanted people to get to know different parts of Japan. And he was thinking about, well, how can I get people interested in all these different places in Japan? He says, I know, created a show called The Cat's Eye View of Japan. These segments are like 6 or 7 minutes long. And he basically takes his outstanding equipment and his lifetime of artistic sensibility and uses it to follow little stray cats around Japan, and you get to know the people who feed the stray cats and take care of them, and what industries are they next to. Like there's one that works out on the fishing docks and is working the nets and hanging out with the fishermen. And so it's also a way to teach you about the neighborhood and the place. It's just such a clever idea. There's nothing like that in the United States. We don't have any shows like that. It's amazing. But again, pursuit of excellence, right? What if people actually cared about genius? What if they weren't intimidated by it? What if they wanted to promote it? What is, everybody's got their gifts. What are your gifts? How does the culture structure itself to make it possible for your gifts to flower as much as possible, so you become your own weird person who has your own weird things that you're weirdly good at and weirdly care about, and then we'll put you on a TV program so that other people can go, ooh, I want to be weird too. I wonder what my weird thing is. It's interesting. So anyway, Blake's comments about genius make me think about that. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it seems like what you said is a double-edged sword, as well as always seems to be a double-edged sword. I like what you said, but but the baseline has to be a respect for humanity, right? You could say a peach is not humanity, that's fine. But if you take it too far, then you are essentially singing hymn to the Spartan society. They find these developed kids, they just throw them into the pit. Just get rid of those cripples and whatever. I'm not sure if that would be good. That would be the double-edged sword. You could go too far and say, I don't have respect for anything, not even humanity, as long as we get the best, the most excellent warriors in this case, So, yeah, I think we have to establish a baseline that somehow there has to be some respect and some care for humanity as a whole. And that would be the same thing. We don't have enough of a baseline for caring about humanity with AI, you know. But by the way, these days AI is not just giving you information and machines. Like I said, it could outplay the greatest chess player and the greatest Go player in the world, you know. And in other words, it is doing some kind of thinking. It's not consciousness thinking, but tactical thinking, you know. It has worked out many possibilities much faster than any of us could do in terms of how to move in relationship to the tactics that there is within the rules it's taught. And it also develops its own rule. And in other words, we are actually learning how to play Go from AI. You know, it's not just like, no, we taught you the basics. Now, you know, you develop and you could just go to the limits, but they're actually inventing new tactics that we never considered. So, yeah. So I think the problem is that we have diverged so much that we finally don't have enough respect for humanity as a baseline, and that's a problem because then, you know, everything could go beyond what is good for humanity. You know, and it's like you might say, well, yeah, if computer actually could be conscious and think better, wouldn't it be better if the world was this place with just smarter and more conscious beings? You know, on the one hand, I almost like that thought, but I don't think I like it because I guess I'm biased to human beings. So that's my own prejudice. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's in computer science, we don't call it thinking. And only in the AI subdivision of computer science do they even call it intelligence. We call it calculation or computation. It's a glorified calculator, and if it follows an algorithm, and the algorithm is pretty static. You know, it can be very data driven, which can make it seem very responsive, but the algorithm itself tends to be pretty static and only change now and then through human intervention. And the reasons for that are go way back in the history of computer science, but in general, people are strongly discouraged from writing programs that can edit themselves. It gets into levels of complexity in trying to figure out whether this thing will ever work correctly that we can't handle. We can barely handle a program that doesn't change itself. We still make a lot of mistakes, but if the program can change itself, then it's like an infinite number of possible mistakes, and we no longer know how to write test programs to figure out if it'll ever do the right thing. So yeah, as much as I'm very interested in AI and I follow it closely, I'm one of those people who I always put the intelligence part in quotation marks. And especially if we talk about what a computer's doing as thinking, I put it in quotation marks because it's not, it lacks creativity. Even when it's very data driven, it lacks creativity. Whereas, you know, the ancients say that the most important duty that human beings have is to edit ourselves, right? To take responsibility for our ethos, for our character, and become a self-modifying program, if you will.
Well, but isn't the very advanced computers based on a neural network of sorts? And so it develops its own neural network in a way, right? It's like,
Well,
so therefore I think it's
we call it a neural net.
possibilities.
We call it a neural net, but that doesn't make it a neural net.
All right.
It's like we can call it artificial intelligence, but that doesn't make it artificial intelligence. We're using metaphors and branding to name these things because it would be much harder to tell you literally what it does. We don't, you know, the language lags to explain how these work. What we're doing is we're simulating a neural net, but we haven't actually created one because we still don't know how the human brain works. I mean, we really don't. You know, we've learned a lot about various neurotransmitters and the roles that they play, but we still don't really know how it all works together. So we're certainly not capable of creating one ourselves. We created something much, 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 much simpler, but it reminds us of a neural net, so we called it one. And it's more like a neural net. The reason we gave it the name neural net is it's more like a neural net than the stuff we normally write, which is nothing like a neural net. So this thing is just like faintly, vaguely, slightly reminiscent of a neural net, like it's the same color. It's that level of similarity. It's got structurally, it's got a bit of echo of how the neural net is structured, but it isn't a neural net remotely. It's hard to explain these things even to people who've worked in software for decades, let alone to people who don't work in software. But effectively, all computers are glorified calculators. And it turns out there's a lot you can do with a calculator. You can do amazing things with a calculator, but it doesn't stop being a calculator just because you did those amazing things with it. And the clearest clue that we're not able to create artificial intelligence is that we still think IQ tests measure biological intelligence, which they absolutely don't. We're really in the dark when it comes to understanding how the human mind works. So the things we're creating represent that confusion. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just wanted to offer an observation. This is one of the shorter chapters we have, but Kenneth's chapters, if you measure them in sort of intellectual effort, they're all remarkably similar in length. He doesn't really do you a favor by having a short chapter. It just meant he condensed the material more. And are you telling me that we can't have provably correct human beings? I mean, correctness is something that programmers prize for their programs, but it escapes both natural and artificial intelligence.
What Donald's alluding to, for those of you who didn't study computer science, is one of the things they teach you when you study computer science is humility. It's astonishing the things you think you should be able to do easily that instead turn out not just to be hard, but to be completely impossible. It's like the difference between two bodies that have gravity orbiting each other and calculating what would happen is on one level of difficulty, but you just add one more body, just go from 2 to 3, and until recently it was completely not calculable. It's like, yes, sun and moon we can just about work out, but sun and moon and earth, no chance, can't do it. It's impossible. It's too hard. And recently they cracked it because we keep adding more horsepower to our computers, and we finally got to the point where we could dogpile massive amounts of computing onto the 3-body problem and crack it. It had been like 50, 60 years since it had been identified as uncrackable, and we finally cracked it. So you can imagine we can count up to 3 now, and it took us decades to get from 2 to 3. 4-body problem, no, too many computations. So what he's alluding to is called the halting problem, and it's one of the most famous lessons in computer science, and it goes like this. Everybody wants provably correct software. I mean, who the hell wants software that's going to give you the wrong answer? Right? I'm gonna launch this nuclear missile, and I would like 100% certainty that I'm not launching it on my own capital. So, prove that your program that covers the guidance for this missile will not put it on my capital. And the answer is, you can mathematically prove that. Not only can't I prove that we're not about to bomb our own capital, I can't even prove that my program will ever halt, which is a much simpler problem. It's called the halting problem. Can you even prove that your software will at least stop, regardless of whether it gets the right answer, will at least stop so that it can produce some answer? And you can prove that you can't prove it. And it's something we all, in undergraduate school, we all do the proof. And it's done to teach us humility. The halting problem is an embarrassing revelation of how adding more power doesn't necessarily give you more solutions. Sometimes it just means you discover the limits of human intelligence and how much time we have before we die. It's like, yeah, well, maybe some immortal being might have no problem solving this thing, but you have no chance. You won't be around long enough.
Well, for artificial intelligence, there's a Stanislaw Lem observation he makes that when an artificial intelligence starts trying to devise tests for human intelligence, we'll know they've gotten pretty darn smart, you know. We don't actually have to devise a test. When they start probing us, we'll know.
Yes. The Turing test. And you've seen the joke undergraduate Turing test that says we can prove that a Twinkie is as intelligent as an undergrad. And we start by sending the undergrad out for a night of drinking. And so the test is conducted while he's lying comatose in his dorm. It's like, now, does the Twinkie perform subpar on any test you can imagine compared to this unconscious undergrad? The answer is no, the Twinkie performs every bit as well as the undergrad does. Therefore, the Twinkie is as intelligent as the undergrad. We have achieved artificial intelligence. Let us all celebrate now. Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So this is sort of relating back to the idea that God acts through humans, like to the fantasy novels you were talking about. And my thinking is that if computers actually get to the point where they're insanely smarter than humans, they're going to realize that humans are essential for the functioning of the world and are able to do things that computers just aren't built to do. Like there's probably aspects to humans even beyond our intelligence that are extremely important. That's just my bias. And so a computer of extreme intelligence would probably recognize that. It would actually be, from my perspective, a sort of almost a thoughtless computer that would be the most likely to cause us problems.
Thank you, Phineas. Yeah, this is one of the things Aristotle said. We want to understand the potential of human beings. You can't look at the passed out undergrad lying on the floor of his dorm. You have to look at the best specimens. You have to look at some master gardener who's been gardening for 70 years. You have to look at some master chef, some little Italian grandma who's been cooking meals her whole life, and now she's 96 and still she can outcook, people who just came out of culinary school. With top honors because she's got the gift, right? You got to look at people. You can't look at the cheetah with a broken leg. You have to look at the cheetah that is the fastest of the cheetahs, and that's when you start to say, what is the peak potential that this species is aiming towards? What is it trying to become? And he said, and of course, the challenge, Kenneth Smith says, for moderns is that the modern world stamps out the development of the heuristic brain. We're stuck at the first two stages of development, either the Dulic or the Banausic, and it makes it very difficult to figure out what we're capable of because we basically got both hands tied behind our backs all the time within these systems of mechanisms and gears and rules and policies and monies that everything is designed to keep us from acting with our full creative intelligence. And as Donald's pointed out on previous calls, we'll never get to see that peak mature human mind at work. We'll never develop it ourselves because we don't have it around to see in action. The way that Aristotle says you develop this capacity is by finding somebody who's already living that way and follow them around and see what they do, see how they solve problems, see how they think about things. But in the modern world, we've exterminated that. So there's no examples for us to follow. And as a result, if we as Marxists are always saying, come the revolution, it's like, well, come the revolution, we're gonna have a big problem. Because what are the new world full of creative intelligences is going to have no examples to follow. We're going to be basically back in the sure, but at the level of mental maturity, starting way back at the Stone Age, trying to figure out, well, what does a creative adult human mind look like when it's not propped up by all of these systems of rules and laws always telling it what to do. How does a person think? So, you know, computers are going to have a tough time evaluating Homo sapiens. We're very variable.
Just another aspect I was thinking of with it too is it's almost inbuilt, the difference between humans and computers, and that humans, because we're life, we're able to make order out of chaos. So it's sort of a chaotic environment, and we're actually able to create order out of that. So we do have a tendency towards more harmony. Whereas a computer, because it's running electricity and it's made of electrical part, it's actually falling apart as it's being used.
Yes.
So computers actually, they've got a set lifespan in terms of the number of resources available, whereas we can reuse those indefinitely.
Yeah.
And so I figure a computer is actually going to we're going to end up recognizing how valuable they are, but start using them much more sparingly as time goes on, just like fuel or fire.
For the things that they're good at, as opposed to everything. Yeah. Before we break, Joe, you had your hand up before you dropped off. Did you want to add something?
No, I just want to ask, like, maybe it's a question for some other time. It's just this idea that maybe it's not thinking, but at the very least, it's kind of making these lateral connections.
Yes.
And so, I mean, you know, and what's the implication of that at the very least? So, I mean, you know, you may not say that's creativity, but what happens out of that? You know, so that's an interesting way to kind of consider it, because there will be some, not maybe you wouldn't call them new things, but they're going to be new to us in a sense.
Yes.
Anyway, just a thought.
I'm with you. They're incredibly useful. I mean, particularly they're useful for getting repetitive, consistent results, which human beings are terrible at. And there's all kinds of places in life where you really would like a consistent result. Like, you know, what if the pilot never crashed the plane? What if they landed it correctly every single time? I think most of us would care for that. That would be nice. But people are so variable. It's like, I don't know, is this his 7th flight in a row and he's being propped up with, you know, pills to keep him awake? Maybe the computer would, you know, should step in at this point and help out. And computers work great as a prosthesis. They're sort of terrible as a replacement, I think is my assessment on much like a hammer. You know, I'd rather have a human being, but you know, best of all is if I could have a human being with a hammer. That's you know, a better combo. As they can together, they can do things that neither of them can do separately. Well, next week we'll pick up with the 6th. I think it's the final quote from Blake, and then get into Kenneth Smith's own text that follows, which is, as Donald said earlier, it's chewy and dense and interesting, but you knew it was going to be because this chapter is physically shorter, which means he's just crammed more data into it, stuffed more into his sentences and paragraphs. So I hope y'all had a good time. I had a good time. Highlight of my week. Thank you all.
Why don't he just write in the equations?